For 37 years, the longest war in American history raged across the deserts and mountains of the Southwest. It was a conflict that spanned hundreds of thousands of square miles, a brutal clash of cultures that pitted the United States against a people who refused to be conquered. This was a war of legendary figures: Geronimo, Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, men whose names became synonymous with resistance. But how did this conflict, which cost thousands of lives and shaped the American West, truly begin? What drove a people to fight for decades against impossible odds? And how did the kidnapping of a single boy ignite a firestorm of violence that would burn for nearly 4 decades? This is the untold story of the Apache Wars, a conflict born from misunderstanding, betrayal, and a relentless cycle of revenge. It is a story of incredible bravery and unspeakable cruelty, of brilliant military strategy and desperate survival. From the sun-scorched plains of Texas to the rugged peaks of the Sierra Madre, this was a war that defined a generation and left a legacy of blood and fire on the land. Today, we uncover the entire history of the Apache Wars, from the first sparks of conflict to the final dramatic surrender. This is the story of a people's fight for their homeland, their freedom, and their very existence. Welcome to the entire history of the Apache Wars. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Chapter 1. The Land Called Apachería. In the mists of time, between the years 1200 and 1500 CE, a great migration began that would forever change the face of the American Southwest. From the frozen lands of the far north, a proud and fierce people began their long journey south, following ancient trails that wound through mountain passes and across vast plains. They were the Apache, and they were coming home to a land that would become their fortress, their sanctuary, and ultimately their battlefield. The land they claimed was a realm of breathtaking beauty and terrifying harshness. It was a country of soaring mountain peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, of deep canyons that plunged into the earth's very heart, of vast deserts where the sun could kill a man in hours and the nights could freeze his blood in his veins. This was Apachería, a territory that stretched from the rolling plains of what would become Texas, across the rugged highlands of New Mexico, through the scorching deserts of Arizona, and deep into the Sierra Madre of Mexico. It was a land that covered hundreds of thousands of square miles, a domain larger than many European kingdoms. The Apache who settled this harsh paradise were not a single tribe, but a confederation of related peoples, each with their own customs, their own leaders, their own sacred places. There were the Chiricahua, the lords of the southeastern mountains, masters of the high peaks and hidden valleys. There were the Mescalero, the people of the mescal plant, who ruled the desert borderlands between New Mexico and Texas. The western Apache controlled the central highlands of Arizona, while the Jicarilla claimed the northern reaches of New Mexico. Each band was fiercely independent, yet all were bound together by language, by culture, and by an unshakable belief that this land was theirs by divine right. For the Apache, the land was not merely a place to live, it was a living entity, a sacred mother who provided for her children. Every mountain had its spirit, every spring its guardian, every canyon its story. They moved with the seasons like the wind itself, following the great herds of buffalo that thundered across the plains, hunting deer and elk in the high country, gathering the fruits of the desert in the valleys below. They were nomads by choice, not necessity, people who understood that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in freedom. Their society was built around the extended family, the clan, and the band. Leadership was earned through wisdom, courage, and the ability to provide for one's people. Chiefs were not kings, but guides, men who led by example rather than by command. Women held positions of great respect and influence, for it was through the female line that Apache identity was passed down through the generations. Children were raised not just by their parents, but by the entire community, learning the skills they would need to survive in a world where weakness meant death. The Apache were warriors by necessity, for Apachería was a contested land. To the south lived the Comanche, fierce horsemen who raided deep into Apache territory. To the west were the Pima and Papago, agricultural peoples who had long memories of Apache raids on their villages. But the Apache were more than just raiders. They were traders, diplomats, and survivors. They traded with the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande, exchanging buffalo hides and meat for corn, pottery, and turquoise. They formed alliances when it served their purposes and broke them when it did not. Above all, they endured. In 1541, this ancient world was forever changed by the arrival of a man whose name would echo through the centuries. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, the Spanish conquistador, leading an expedition of over 1,000 men in search of the mythical 7 cities of gold, became the first European to encounter the Apache in their homeland. Coronado's chroniclers describe them as a people who lived like Arabs, nomads who followed the buffalo herds and lived in portable lodges made of buffalo hide. The Spanish were amazed by what they saw. Here was a people who had mastered one of the harshest environments on earth, who could survive where Spanish soldiers died of thirst and exposure. The Apache warriors were tall and lean, their bodies hardened by a lifetime of warfare and hunting. They could run for days without rest, track a single horse across miles of rocky ground, and disappear into the landscape like ghosts. Their women were equally impressive, skilled in the arts of survival, capable of keeping their families alive in conditions that would have killed European settlers in days. But Coronado found no gold in Apachería, only a people who valued freedom above wealth, who measured success not in silver and jewels, but in horses stolen and enemies defeated. Disappointed, the Spanish expedition moved on, leaving the Apache to their ancient ways. For the next century and a half, contact between the two peoples was sporadic and largely peaceful. This changed dramatically in the late 1600s as Spanish colonization of the Southwest began in earnest. Missions were built, presidios established, and settlers began to trickle into the borderlands. The Spanish colonial system was based on the encomienda, a feudal arrangement that granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from indigenous peoples. But the Apache were not the sedentary agricultural peoples the Spanish were used to dealing with. They could not be easily conquered, converted, or controlled. Instead, a complex relationship developed between the Spanish and the Apache, one that combined elements of warfare, diplomacy, and trade. The Spanish established a system of feeding stations where Apache bands could come to receive rations of food and supplies in exchange for keeping the peace. This system, known as the Establecimientos de Paz, worked reasonably well for over a century. The Apache received goods they needed, metal tools, weapons, cloth, and food during times of scarcity, while the Spanish gained a measure of security for their frontier settlements. During this period, the Apache adapted and evolved. They became master horsemen, incorporating the Spanish horse into their culture so completely that it seemed they had always been mounted warriors. They learned to use firearms, though they never abandoned their traditional weapons, the bow and arrow, the lance, and the war club. They developed new tactics and strategies, becoming perhaps the most formidable guerrilla fighters the world had ever seen. The Spanish period also saw the emergence of great Apache leaders whose names would become legend. There was Cuchillo Negro, the Black Knife, a Warm Springs Apache chief whose raids terrorized the Spanish settlements of New Mexico. There was Maco, a Chiricahua leader who united several bands under his leadership and waged a decades-long war against the Spanish. These men were not mere raiders, but military geniuses who understood that their survival depended on their ability to strike fast and disappear, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. But the Spanish period was also marked by tragedy and betrayal. In 1788, Spanish forces launched a coordinated campaign against the Apache, using a new and terrible weapon: smallpox-infected blankets. The disease swept through Apache camps like wildfire, killing thousands and leaving entire bands decimated. It was a preview of the horrors that would come with the arrival of the Americans. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and everything changed. The new Mexican government, struggling to control its vast northern territories, lacked the resources and the will to maintain the old Spanish system of accommodation with the Apache. The feeding stations were closed, the treaties abandoned, and the Apache were left to fend for themselves. Worse, the Mexicans adopted a policy that would have consequences for generations to come. They began offering bounties for Apache scalps. In 1835, the state of Sonora offered 100 pesos for the scalp of an adult Apache male, 50 pesos for that of a woman, and 25 pesos for a child. Other Mexican states quickly followed suit, creating a lucrative market for professional scalp hunters. These men, mostly Americans and Europeans, drawn by the promise of easy money, began a campaign of extermination that would push the Apache to the very brink of extinction. The most notorious of these scalp hunters was John Johnson, an American trader who had gained the trust of several Apache bands. In 1837, Johnson invited a large group of Apache to a feast at the abandoned copper mines of Santa Rita. As the Apache sat eating and drinking, Johnson and his men opened fire with a concealed cannon loaded with scrap metal. 20 Apache were killed instantly, including the respected Chief Compa. The survivors scattered, but the damage was done. The age of accommodation was over. The age of blood had begun. From the ashes of this betrayal rose a new leader, a man whose name would become synonymous with Apache resistance, Mangas Coloradas, the Red Sleeves. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a physical presence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure, Mangas was more than just a war chief. He was a visionary who understood that the Apache's only hope for survival lay in unity. Under his leadership, the scattered Apache bands began to come together as never before, united by a common enemy and a shared desire for revenge. The Mexican period saw some of the bloodiest fighting in Apache history. Mangas Coloradas led raid after raid into Mexican territory, striking at mining camps, ranches, and towns with a ferocity that terrified the Mexican settlers. The copper mines of Santa Rita, scene of Johnson's treachery, were attacked and destroyed, their workers killed or driven off. The town of Llanos was burned to the ground. Entire regions of northern Mexico were depopulated as settlers fled south, abandoning their homes and their dreams to the Apache war parties. But the Mexicans fought back with equal brutality. They hired more scalp hunters, men like James Kirker, an Irishman who claimed to understand the Apache mind. Kirker's company of scalp hunters, a mixed force of Americans, Mexicans, and Shoshone warriors, killed hundreds of Apache over the course of several years. In 1846, they perpetrated one of the worst massacres in Apache history, attacking a peaceful gathering at Galeana and killing 130 men, women, and children. Among the dead was the father of a young warrior named Cochise, a man who would one day become one of the most famous Apache leaders in history. The massacre at Galeana was a turning point, not just for Cochise, but for the entire Apache nation. It demonstrated that there could be no peace with the Mexicans, no accommodation, no middle ground. It was a war of extermination, and the Apache would fight it as such. Young warriors like Cochise and Geronimo, their hearts hardened by loss and betrayal, swore blood oaths of revenge that would shape the next half-century of southwestern history. In 1846, as the Apache War with Mexico reached its bloody climax, a new player entered the game. The United States, driven by its doctrine of manifest destiny, declared war on Mexico. For the Apache, this presented both an opportunity and a dilemma. The Americans were enemies of their enemies, but could they be trusted? The answer came in the form of Kit Carson, the legendary mountain man and scout who approached Apache leaders with an offer of alliance. Carson, who had lived among various Indian tribes and spoke several native languages, understood the Apache in a way that few white men did. He offered them a simple deal: help the Americans defeat the Mexicans, and the United States would treat them fairly and honorably. For leaders like Mangas Coloradas, it seemed like a reasonable bargain. The Apache had no love for the Mexicans, and the Americans seemed to offer a chance for a fresh start. Apache warriors served as scouts and guides for American forces, leading them through the treacherous mountain passes of their homeland and helping them avoid Mexican ambushes. They provided intelligence on Mexican troop movements and supply lines. In return, the Americans treated them as allies rather than enemies, a refreshing change from the Mexican policy of extermination. But this alliance was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Americans saw the Apache as useful allies in a temporary conflict, people who could be discarded once their usefulness was over. The Apache, on the other hand, believed they were entering into a permanent partnership, one that would guarantee their rights and their territory in the new order that was to come. The war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which transferred the vast majority of Apachería to the United States. For the Apache, this should have been a moment of triumph. They had helped their new allies defeat their old enemies, and now they expected to reap the rewards of their loyalty. Instead, they found themselves facing a new and even more dangerous threat. The discovery of gold in California that same year brought a flood of American prospectors and settlers into the Southwest. These were not the Spanish colonists of old, content to establish a few missions and presidios and coexist with the native peoples. These were Americans driven by dreams of wealth and opportunity, convinced of their right to take whatever they wanted from a land they saw as empty and unused. The Americans brought with them a different concept of land ownership, one that was completely alien to the Apache way of thinking. Where the Apache saw a living landscape to be shared and respected, the Americans saw property to be bought, sold, and exploited. Where the Apache saw sacred sites and ancestral hunting grounds, the Americans saw potential mines, ranches, and towns. The stage was now set for a conflict that would dwarf all previous wars in its scope and brutality. The Apache, who had survived Spanish colonization and Mexican persecution, now faced their greatest challenge yet: the full might of the United States, a nation convinced of its destiny to rule the continent from sea to shining sea. It would be a war that would last 37 years, claim thousands of lives, and forever change the face of the American West. As the 1840s drew to a close, the Apache stood at a crossroads. Behind them lay centuries of freedom, of life lived according to the ancient ways of their ancestors. Ahead lay an uncertain future in a world increasingly dominated by the white man's laws, the white man's values, and the white man's hunger for land and gold. They could not know that their world was about to be shattered by the arrival of a new enemy, one whose power and determination would push them to the very brink of extinction. The longest war in American history was about to begin. Chapter 2: The One-Eyed Boy. It was early in January 1861 when a warrior named Beto led his raiders south. Beto was not born Apache. He was a Mexican, captured years before by the Aravaipa band, and he wore a distinctive leather patch over the eye he had lost. The Mexicans had called him Victor, but among the Apache, he had proven his worth. Through his deeds in battle, he had risen to become a leader, a rare feat for a captive who were never fully trusted, and called Yodasin, born outside. But Beto possessed what the Apache called enemies against power, a spiritual force that made a warrior preternaturally swift and powerful, like a cougar. It was a power that inspired others to follow him without question, a power shared by the most feared of Apache warriors, a man named Geronimo. Beto had gathered a dozen men for this raid. The reasons were as varied as the men themselves. The band was in need, and a raid for livestock was a matter of survival. For the younger men, it was a chance to escape the monotony of camp life, the nagging of wives, or simply to seek the thrill of adventure and build their reputations as warriors. For the novices, teenage boys not yet blooded in battle, it was an opportunity to learn, to take the first step on the path to becoming a man, even if their only duty was to tend to the horses. The warriors prepared themselves with ancient rituals. They painted their faces for war, some with a single white stripe across the nose and under the eyes, others with bold strokes of red or black. They tied their long hair up on top of their heads so it would not blind them in the heat of battle. They carried rations of dried mescal, buckskin sacks filled with parched corn, and sweet cakes made from the fruit of the prickly pear. Each man's pony was laden with at least 4 extra pairs of moccasins, for the land they crossed was vast and unforgiving. They spoke the language of war, a special vocabulary used only on the raid, with unique words for everything from horses and mules to the white men they now hunted. They observed the strict taboos that governed the warpath. A man whose wife was pregnant could not go, for her touch would spoil the aim of his weapons. Fear was never spoken of. A man who stayed behind was called lazy, never a coward. To break these rules was to invite disaster. Among them was a novice, a decoy, on his first raid. For 4 days before they left, an older warrior had instructed him in the ways of the warpath. He learned the special language, the taboos, and how to carry himself among the seasoned fighters. He was given a special cap adorned with the feathers of 4 different birds: hummingbird for speed, oriole for a clear mind, quail to startle the enemy, and the downy feathers of an eagle for protection. "White men will be scared of that," his teacher told him, speaking of the quail feathers. "You know how quail jump right out from under you and scare you." He was also given a scratching stick, for it was forbidden to touch his own skin with his fingers, and a drinking tube, for his lips must not touch the water directly. His only weapons were a bow and 4 wooden-tipped arrows, meant for hunting birds, not men, a reminder to keep his mind on the purpose of the raid, to provide for the people, not to seek death. As the war party rode out at dawn, the people of the village lined the trail, sprinkling the novice with sacred pollen and chanting prayers. They called out to him, telling him he would return in 30 days, and when he replied in the affirmative, they knew it would be so. He was not to think of killing, only of the horses and cattle they so desperately needed. After 4 such successful raids, he would be a warrior. The moon was a cold, bright eye in the winter sky when Beto and his men looked down upon the ranch of John Ward. It lay in the narrow valley carved by Sonoyta Creek, a tempting prize rich with cattle and horses. They watched from the bluffs all night, silent and patient as the stones around them. At dawn, they descended. Most of the warriors moved on foot, slipping through the chaparral like ghosts, while Beto and a few others remained mounted to round up the herd. The ranch was strangely quiet. No men were visible, only a scrawny boy tending a small flock of sheep and goats across the creek. The cattle grazed peacefully near the irrigation ditches Ward had dug for, his small orchard of peach trees. As 9 warriors crept toward the silent ranch house, another group began to drive the cattle from the pasture. Beto rode toward the peach orchard. There, perched in the bare branches of a small tree, was a boy, frozen in terror. Apache custom would have been to kill him, either on the spot or later, back at the village. But Beto hesitated. As he drew closer, he saw that the boy, like himself, had only one good eye. The boy's blind eye, recently gouged by the antler of a wounded deer, was raw and uncovered. Perhaps it was this strange kinship, this shared mark of fate, that moved Beto to mercy. He motioned for the boy to come down from the tree and climb onto the pony behind him. Suddenly, a cry went up. 2 riders were approaching. The raiders at the ranch house scrambled for their ponies as the others herded the cattle together. With the captive boy clinging to his back, Beto led the retreat north. 2 of Ward's cowboys, arriving to find the ranch house untouched, but the boy and cattle gone, gave chase. The Apaches scattered, splitting into 3 groups to confuse their pursuers. Beto instructed the novice to perform a ritual to slow them down. The boy dismounted, drew a line across their trail with a stick, and chanted, "Let no one pass over this." He did this 4 times, and with this powerful medicine, they vanished into the wilderness, leaving the pursuing White Eyes far behind. John Ward returned to his ranch later that day to a scene of chaos and despair. His stepson, Felix Tellis, was gone. The boy's mother, Modesta, was inconsolable. The Apaches, the boogeymen of her people for generations, the raiders who had turned her ancestral village into a ghost town and slain her friends and relatives, had now stolen her firstborn son. She pleaded with Ward, her voice thick with anguish, to get him back. Ward, a rough and often drunk Irishman, was not a man to be trifled with when his property was at stake. He rode immediately to Fort Buchanan, a ramshackle collection of adobe buildings 12 miles to the north. The fort's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pitcairn Morrison, was 65 years old and better suited for retirement than for the rigors of a frontier command. He listened to Ward's furious report. A boy and 20 head of cattle had been taken. Morrison, lacking the experience and decisiveness of his predecessor, Captain Richard Ewell, was at a loss. The fort was undermanned. 2 of its best companies of dragoons had recently been transferred north to the newly established Fort Breckinridge. The responsibility for pursuing the raiders fell to the most junior officer at the post, Second Lieutenant George Nicholas Bascom. Bascom was a recent graduate of West Point, class of 1858, a Kentuckian with a promising career ahead of him. He was ambitious, by the book, and utterly inexperienced in the ways of the Apache. Morrison's orders were clear and dangerously simplistic. Pursue the Indians and recover a boy made captive by them. He was authorized to use whatever force he deemed necessary. Armed with these orders and 54 men of the 7th Infantry, Bascom set out, with John Ward riding alongside him, his heart burning for revenge. The trail led northeast toward the stronghold of the most powerful of the Chiricahua chiefs, a man named Cochise. Bascom, in his ignorance, made a fatal assumption that Cochise was responsible. It was a mistake that would set the entire Southwest ablaze. Chapter 3. The Bascom affair. Apache Pass was the key to the entire region. A natural corridor through the Chiricahua Mountains, it held the one thing all travelers in the desert sought with a desperate thirst: a reliable source of water. The Apache Spring, a life-giving oasis, flowed into a small ravine that cut through the mountains, a place of shade and shelter in a land of sun and rock. It was here, in this vital passage, that the Butterfield Overland Mail Company had built a station, a small fortified outpost of adobe and stone. The station's very existence depended on the goodwill of the man who controlled the pass, the mighty Chokonan chief, Cochise. Cochise, born in 1810 in the heart of the Chiricahua Mountains, was a man of imposing presence. Standing over 6 feet tall with a powerful build and a prominent Roman nose that gave him his Apache name, Gochi, he was a leader who commanded respect. Influenced by his father-in-law, the great Mangas Coloradas, Cochise had long been an advocate for peace with the Americans. He had even aided the Butterfield stage line, supplying the station at Apache Pass with firewood and hay, and on several occasions had returned stolen livestock. But the station master, James Tevis, a man who knew Cochise well, held a cynical view of the chief. At first appearance, a man would think he was inclined to be peaceable to Americans, but he is far from it, Tevis had written. He is the biggest liar in the territory, and would kill an American for any trifle, provided he thought it wouldn't be found out. It was to this complex and volatile world that Lieutenant George Bascom rode in early February 1861. He arrived at the Apache Pass station and sent a messenger to Cochise's village, requesting a meeting. Cochise, unsuspecting, agreed. He had always dealt fairly with the Americans and had no reason to believe this time would be any different. He arrived at Bascom's tent with his wife, his 6-year-old son, his brother, and 2 nephews, a gesture of peace and trust. Bascom, however, was not interested in diplomacy. He served coffee, a gesture of hospitality that was a calculated deception. As soon as the cups were empty, he made his accusation. "Your people have stolen a boy and some cattle," he declared, his voice cold and hard. "I am holding you until they are returned." Cochise was stunned. He truthfully denied any knowledge of the raid, correctly deducing that it was the work of the Coyoteros, a different Apache band. He even offered to use his influence to find the boy and the stolen cattle. But Bascom, convinced of Cochise's guilt and determined to follow his orders to the letter, refused to listen. "You are my prisoner," he repeated. In that moment, Cochise realized he had been betrayed. With a sudden, desperate movement, he drew his knife, slashed a hole in the back of the tent, and burst out into the open. John Ward, who had been waiting outside, fired his pistol, wounding the fleeing chief in the leg. But Cochise, fueled by adrenaline and outrage, scrambled up the rocky slope and disappeared into the mountains. That night, the signal fires of the Apache burned on the mountaintops, calling the warriors to arms. Cochise, his heart black with rage, was joined by the fierce Geronimo and the wise Mangas Coloradas. By morning, Bascom and his men found themselves surrounded. Under a white flag of truce, Cochise approached the American camp. He again denied his involvement in the raid and demanded the release of his family. Bascom refused. As Cochise turned to leave, gunfire erupted, and one of the stage station employees was captured by the Apaches. The standoff had escalated. Cochise, now desperate, sought more leverage. He sent Geronimo to attack a passing wagon train. The warriors killed 6 of the Mexican teamsters and captured 3 white men. In a brutal act of revenge, they tied 2 of the Mexican captives to the wagon wheels and burned them alive. Cochise sent a message to Bascom. The lives of his hostages would depend on the treatment of the Apache prisoners. The message never arrived. Bascom, now reinforced by a larger contingent of troops under the command of a more senior officer, Lieutenant Isaiah Moore, found himself in a position of strength. The Apaches, seeing the arrival of the reinforcements, melted away into the mountains. 4 days later, Bascom and Moore discovered the mutilated bodies of the white hostages. In a fit of rage, Moore ordered the execution of the 6 male Apache prisoners. Bascom, to his credit, argued against it, but the decision was made by a grim game of cards. Moore won. The 6 Apache men, including Cochise's brother and 2 nephews, were hanged from the branches of an oak tree, their bodies left to swing in the desert wind. Cochise's wife and son were forced to watch. This was the Bascom affair, a tragedy of errors, a fatal cocktail of arrogance, ignorance, and cultural misunderstanding. It was the spark that ignited the flames of a war that would consume the Southwest for a generation. For Cochise, the diplomat who had sought peace, the betrayal was absolute. The man who had once been a friend to the Americans was now their most implacable enemy. The war for Apachería had begun in earnest. Chapter 4. America Divided. Apache United. The news of the hangings at Apache Pass spread like a poison through the veins of Apachería. For Cochise, the grief was a living thing, a fire in his belly that consumed all thoughts of peace. The time for talk was over. The time for blood had come. He declared war, not just on the soldiers who had murdered his family, but on all Americans. The Chiricahua, once the most peaceful of the Apache bands, were now the most warlike. Cochise, his heart hardened by a grief that would never heal, unleashed a wave of terror across the Arizona and New Mexico territories. He struck with a fury that stunned the Americans. Ranches were burned, mines were abandoned, and travelers were ambushed without mercy. The Butterfield Overland Mail, the symbol of American expansion, was forced to shut down its operations in the region. The lifeline to the east had been severed. In the summer of 1861, a strange and unexpected event occurred, one that would have profound consequences for the war in the Southwest. The American nation, which had seemed so powerful and united, suddenly turned on itself. The Civil War had begun. The federal government, now locked in a desperate struggle for its own survival, was forced to withdraw the majority of its troops from the frontier. Forts that had once been bustling with activity were now manned by skeleton crews. The blue-coated soldiers, who had been the instruments of American power in the region, vanished, seemingly overnight. For the Apache, it was a sign from the heavens. Their enemies were destroying each other. Cochise, a brilliant military strategist, saw the opportunity. He sent messengers to the other Apache bands, calling for a great council of war. He was joined by Mangas Coloradas, the towering chief of the Bedonkohe, his father-in-law, and a man who had been fighting the white man for decades. Geronimo, the fierce Bedonkohe warrior whose hatred for the Mexicans was matched only by his hatred for the Americans, also answered the call. Ju, the enigmatic leader of the Nedni, and other chiefs and warriors from across Apachería gathered in the Dragoon Mountains, Cochise's impregnable fortress. For the first time in their history, the Apache were united. They had a common enemy, a common purpose, and a common desire for revenge. They launched a coordinated campaign against the remaining American settlements and military outposts. Fort Breckinridge and Fort Buchanan were abandoned by their beleaguered garrisons. The few remaining settlers fled to the relative safety of Tucson, which became a virtual island in a sea of Apache warfare. By the end of 1861, the Apache had reclaimed their homeland. The Americans had been driven from Apachería, their dreams of conquest shattered. It was the greatest victory in Apache history, a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their unyielding love for their land. But the victory was not without cost. The constant warfare had taken its toll on the Apache people. They were weary of fighting, and their women and children were suffering. Cochise, even in his moment of triumph, knew that the war was far from over. The white man would return, and when he did, he would come with a vengeance. Chapter 5. The Red Sleeves Mangas. Coloradas, the Red Sleeves, was a giant among his people, both in stature and in influence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, he was a physical specimen who commanded respect and inspired awe. But it was his wisdom, his strategic mind, and his unwavering commitment to the Apache people that made him a legend. He was born in the late 1790s, a time of relative peace between the Apache and the Spanish. But he came of age in a world of increasing violence and betrayal. He was a Bedonkohe, a member of the same band as Geronimo, but his influence extended far beyond his own people. Through a series of strategic marriages, he forged alliances with other Apache bands, creating a powerful confederation that could stand against the encroaching Mexicans and Americans. His own wife was a mescalero, and he married one of his daughters to Cochise, the rising leader of the Chiricahua. These were not just family ties, they were political alliances that bound the Apache people together in a web of kinship and mutual obligation. Mangas Coloradas had seen the promises of the white man broken time and time again. He had witnessed the treachery of the scalp hunters, the greed of the miners, and the arrogance of the soldiers. He had signed treaties of peace only to see them violated before the ink was dry. In 1851, near the mining camp of Pinos Altos, he was attacked by a group of American miners who tied him to a tree and flogged him mercilessly. The physical wounds healed, but the humiliation left a permanent scar on his soul. It was a lesson he would never forget. The white man could not be trusted. Despite this, Mangas Coloradas remained a voice of reason among the Apache. He understood that a full-scale war with the Americans would be suicidal. He counseled patience and diplomacy, even as he led his warriors in retaliatory raids against the Mexicans. He was a pragmatist, a leader who understood the delicate balance of power in the Southwest. He knew when to fight and when to talk, when to raid and when to trade. But the Bascom affair changed everything. The murder of Cochise's family was an unforgivable crime, an act of treachery that demanded a blood response. Mangas Coloradas, bound to Cochise by the marriage of his daughter, had no choice but to support his son-in-law. He joined the Great Council of War in the Dragoon Mountains, his towering presence a symbol of Apache unity and resolve. He brought with him not just his own warriors, but the wisdom of a lifetime spent fighting for his people. In the summer of 1862, Mangas Coloradas and Cochise led a combined force of over 500 warriors in an attack on a column of Union soldiers at Apache Pass. It was one of the largest battles of the Apache Wars, a desperate attempt to drive the Americans from their homeland once and for all. The Apaches fought with a courage and determination that stunned the soldiers, but they were no match for the Americans' superior firepower. The soldiers had cannons, wagons that shoot, as the Apaches called them, and the exploding shells wreaked havoc on the Apache lines. Mangas Coloradas was wounded in the battle, shot in the chest by a soldier's bullet. He was taken to a Mexican doctor in the town of Llanos, a man he had once spared during a raid. The doctor, remembering the chief's act of mercy, saved his life. But the wound was a harbinger of things to come. The world of the Apache was shrinking, their power waning. The old ways were dying, and the future was a dark and uncertain path. In January 1863, Mangas Coloradas, now in his 70s, agreed to meet with an American military commander under a flag of truce. He was tired of fighting, and he hoped to negotiate a lasting peace for his people. It was a fatal mistake. The soldiers, under the command of General Joseph Rodman West, a man known for his brutality, seized the old chief and tortured him throughout the night. They heated their bayonets in the fire and seared his flesh. When he cried out in agony, they shot him. They cut off his head, boiled the flesh from his skull, and sent it to a phrenologist in the east. The man who had been the greatest of all Apache leaders had been murdered and desecrated, his body and his spirit violated in the most profound way imaginable. The murder of Mangas Coloradas was a turning point in the Apache Wars. It was a message to the Apache people that there would be no peace, no mercy, no honor. The Americans were not interested in treaties or negotiations. They were interested in extermination. The war, which had already been brutal, now entered a new and even more savage phase. The death of the Red Sleeves had extinguished the last glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution. The only path left was the path of war without end, the path of war. Chapter 6. The Rise of Geronimo. The murder of Mangas Coloradas sent a shockwave through the Apache world. The message was clear: the Americans could not be trusted. There would be no peace, no negotiation, only war. And in the vacuum left by the death of the great chief, a new leader began to emerge, a man whose name would become a legend, a symbol of resistance, a name whispered in fear and awe: Geronimo. Geronimo was not a chief in the traditional sense. He was a medicine man, a shaman, a man who claimed to have supernatural powers. He was born in the 1820s, a member of the Bedonkohe band, the same as Mangas Coloradas. But where Mangas had been a diplomat, a unifier, a man who sought peace even as he waged war, Geronimo was a warrior, pure and simple. His heart was filled with a burning hatred for the Mexicans who had murdered his wife, his children, and his mother in a brutal massacre at Llanos in 1851. That event had transformed him, turning him into a relentless instrument of vengeance. He was a man of medium height, but with a powerful, muscular build. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes black and piercing, missing none of the details of the world around him. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a brilliant tactician who could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. He knew the mountains and deserts of Apachería better than any man alive, and he used that knowledge to his advantage, leading the American soldiers on a series of frustrating and fruitless chases. After the death of Mangas Coloradas, Geronimo's influence grew. He gathered around him a band of young, disaffected warriors who shared his hatred for the white man and his thirst for revenge. They were men who had grown up in a world of constant conflict, who had seen their families slaughtered, their land stolen, and their way of life destroyed. They were men with nothing left to lose, and they fought with a ferocity that terrified the American settlers and soldiers. Geronimo's war was a war of attrition, a war of raids and ambushes, of stolen livestock and burned ranches. He did not seek to win great battles or conquer territory. He sought to make the cost of occupying Apachería so high that the Americans would be forced to leave. He was a ghost in the mountains, a phantom who could be everywhere and nowhere at once. His name became a curse on the lips of the settlers, a name that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. But Geronimo was not just a warrior, he was a symbol. He was the embodiment of Apache resistance, the living spirit of a people who refused to be conquered. He was the last of the great Apache leaders, the man who would carry the fight for freedom into the final bloody years of the Apache Wars. His story is a story of incredible courage, of unwavering determination, and of a love for his people and his land that burned brighter than any fire. It is the story of a man who, against all odds, dared to defy the most powerful nation on earth, a man who would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. This is the story of Geronimo. Chapter 7. Victorio's War. In the years following the murder of Mangas Coloradas, the Apache resistance, though fierce, became fractured. Cochise, the great Chiricahua chief, continued his war in Arizona, a bitter 10-year struggle that bled the territory dry. But in New Mexico, a new leader emerged, a man who would write his own bloody chapter in the history of the Apache Wars, Victorio. Victorio was a Chihen, a member of the Warm Springs Apache, and he had been a lieutenant of Mangas Coloradas. He was a man in his 50s, with a quiet, dignified presence that masked a fierce and unyielding spirit. He was a brilliant military strategist, a leader who could inspire his warriors to fight with a courage that bordered on the suicidal. He was also a man who had been pushed to the brink, a man who had seen his people herded onto barren reservations, their children starving, their way of life systematically destroyed. In 1877, the American government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to close the Warm Springs Reservation, a small patch of land that the Chihenne considered their sacred homeland. They were forcibly removed to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a place they called Hell's 40 Acres. It was a desolate, disease-ridden wasteland, a place where different Apache bands, many of them traditional enemies, were thrown together in a volatile and explosive mix. It was a place of hunger, of sickness, and of despair. Victorio endured it for as long as he could. He pleaded with the American authorities, begging them to allow his people to return to their beloved Warm Springs. His pleas fell on deaf ears. In 1879, he could take no more. He gathered his followers, a small band of about 200 warriors, and fled the reservation. It was an act of desperation, a flight for freedom that would ignite a new and terrible war. Victorio's war was a whirlwind of violence that swept across New Mexico, Texas, and deep into Mexico. For 14 months, Victorio and his warriors outmaneuvered, outfought, and outwitted the American and Mexican armies. They were a phantom force, a ghost army that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. They raided settlements, ambushed patrols, and fought a series of pitched battles in which they were almost always outnumbered and outgunned. Victorio's military genius was undeniable. He used the rugged terrain of the Southwest to his advantage, leading his pursuers on a series of grueling chases through mountains and deserts that he knew like the back of his hand. He was a master of the ambush, of the feint and the parry, of the lightning-fast raid and the strategic retreat. He was, in the words of one American general, the most brilliant of all the Apache leaders. But Victorio was not just fighting for his own people. He had become a symbol of resistance for all the Apache, and his ranks swelled with warriors from other bands, including the Mescalero and even some Chiricahua. He was also joined by a formidable ally, a woman named Lozan, his sister, who was said to be a gifted prophetess and a skilled warrior, the equal of any man in battle. The American and Mexican governments, infuriated by their inability to capture Victorio, poured thousands of troops into the field. They were relentless in their pursuit, determined to crush this new Apache uprising. In October 1880, they finally cornered him. A combined force of Mexican and American troops, led by a Tarahumara scout who had a personal vendetta against Victorio, trapped the Apache leader and his followers in the Tres Castillos Mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. For 2 days, the Apaches fought with a desperate courage, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Victorio, the great chief who had led his people on a 14-month odyssey of freedom, was killed, along with most of his warriors. The women and children who survived were sold into slavery in Mexico. Victorio's war was over, but the memory of his defiance would live on. He had shown that even a small band of determined warriors could hold the most powerful armies at bay. He had fought for the right of his people to live in their own land, to follow their own traditions, to be free. He had lost, but in his defeat, he had won a place of honor in the long and tragic history of the Apache people. Chapter 8. The Last Stand. The death of Victorio did not end the Apache resistance. It only fueled the flames of hatred and despair. The remnants of his band, along with other renegade Apaches, continued to fight, their raids becoming more desperate, more brutal. But the end was near. The world of the Apache was shrinking, their power fading. The Americans, with their endless supply of soldiers and their relentless determination, were closing in. The final chapter of the Apache Wars belongs to Geronimo. After the death of Victorio, he became the most wanted man in America. The U.S. Army, under the command of General George Crook, a man who both respected and understood the Apache, launched a massive campaign to hunt him down. Crook employed a new strategy. He used Apache scouts to track other Apaches. It was a controversial tactic, but it was brutally effective. The scouts knew the land, they knew the language, and they knew the ways of their own people. For 2 years, Geronimo and his small band of followers, never more than a few dozen warriors, led the American army on a wild chase through the mountains of Arizona and Mexico. They were masters of evasion, of survival, of guerrilla warfare. They lived off the land, they fought with a courage that bordered on the superhuman, and they refused to surrender. But the pressure was relentless. The army was always on their trail, their families were starving, and their world was closing in around them. In 1886, Geronimo, weary of fighting, his people on the brink of starvation, finally agreed to surrender. He met with General Nelson Miles, who had replaced Crook at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. It was a somber and historic occasion. The last of the great Apache leaders, the man who had been the symbol of resistance for a generation, was laying down his arms. Geronimo and his followers were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as criminals. They were loaded onto a train and shipped to Florida, a land of swamps and humidity that was a world away from their beloved desert homeland. They were imprisoned, their children were taken from them and sent to government boarding schools, and their way of life was systematically destroyed. It was a final, brutal act of betrayal. Geronimo, the fierce warrior who had once been the most feared man in America, spent the last 23 years of his life as a prisoner of war. He became a celebrity, a curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. He was displayed at fairs and exhibitions, a living symbol of the savage that had been conquered. He died in 1909, a broken old man, his heart still yearning for the mountains and deserts of his homeland. The surrender of Geronimo marked the end of the Apache Wars, the longest and bloodiest of all the Indian wars in American history. It was a war that had lasted for 37 years, a war that had cost thousands of lives and millions of dollars. It was a war that had been fought with a brutality and a savagery that is difficult to comprehend today. It was a war that had been fought for land, for resources, for a way of life. It was a war that the Apache were destined to lose. But in their defeat, the Apache left a legacy of courage, of resilience, and of an unyielding love for their land and their freedom. They were a people who refused to be conquered, a people who fought for their right to exist, a people who, even in the darkest of times, never lost their spirit. Their story is a tragic story, a story of loss and betrayal, but it is also a story of hope, a story of the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to survive, and to remember. The Apache Wars are over, but the spirit of the Apache lives on. Chapter 9. No Mercy. Carleton's Policy. In the summer of 1862, as the Civil War raged in the East, a new and terrible figure emerged in the Southwest. General James Henry Carleton, a career soldier with a reputation for ruthlessness, was appointed commander of the Department of New Mexico. He was a man who believed in the superiority of American civilization and the inevitability of American expansion. In his view, the Apache were not just enemies of the United States, they were obstacles to progress, relics of a savage past that had no place in the modern world. Carleton was a tall, imposing man with piercing blue eyes and a meticulously groomed beard. He had served in the Mexican War and had spent years fighting Indians on the frontier. He was a man who believed in discipline, in order, and in the absolute authority of the United States government. He was also a man who had no patience for the complexities of Indian policy, no interest in treaties or negotiations. For Carleton, there was only one solution to the Apache problem: total war. His strategy was simple and brutal: extermination. He would not distinguish between hostile and peaceful Apache, between warriors and civilians, between men, women, and children. All Apache were to be considered enemies of the United States, and all were to be treated accordingly. It was a policy that would have been considered barbaric in a war between civilized nations, but Carleton did not consider the Apache to be civilized. "The Indians must be whipped and fear us before they will cease killing and robbing the people," Carleton wrote to his superiors in Washington. "They must be made to feel that every time they go out on a raid, they are liable to be followed and punished. They must be made to understand that we are their masters." Carleton's first target was not the Apache, but the Navajo, another tribe that had been raiding settlements in New Mexico. He launched a campaign of unprecedented brutality against them, destroying their crops, killing their livestock, and forcing them to surrender. Those who did not surrender were hunted down and killed. The survivors were marched 300 miles to a desolate reservation at Bosque Redondo, a place the Navajo called Hueldi, the place of suffering. It was a preview of what was to come for the Apache. With the Navajo subdued, Carleton turned his attention to the Apache. He issued a proclamation that was as chilling as it was clear. "All Indian men of that tribe are to be killed whenever and wherever you can find them. The women and children will not be harmed, but you will take them prisoners and feed them at the nearest military post where you may be stationed." This was not a war. It was a campaign of genocide. Carleton's soldiers were given carte blanche to kill any Apache male they encountered, regardless of age or circumstances. The women and children were to be enslaved, their families destroyed, their culture obliterated. It was a policy that violated every principle of civilized warfare, every treaty the United States had ever signed, every moral standard that the nation claimed to uphold. The soldiers who carried out Carleton's orders were a mixed lot. Some were professional soldiers who followed orders without question. Others were volunteers, men who had come west seeking adventure or fortune and found themselves caught up in a war of extermination. Many were horrified by what they were asked to do, but they did it anyway, bound by military discipline and the fear of court-martial. The Apache, faced with this new and terrible enemy, fought back with a desperation born of the knowledge that they were fighting for their very survival. They struck at military patrols, ambushed supply trains, and raided settlements with a ferocity that shocked even the hardened soldiers. They knew that there would be no mercy, no quarter given, and so they gave none in return. The war that followed was unlike anything that had come before. It was a war without rules, without honor, without humanity. It was a war in which children were murdered in their mothers' arms, in which women were raped and enslaved, in which entire families were wiped out for the crime of being Apache. It was a war that stained the honor of the United States and left scars on the land that would never heal. Carleton's policy was not just brutal, it was also counterproductive. The more savage the American attacks became, the more determined the Apache resistance grew. The survivors of the massacres became hardened warriors, men and women who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They were joined by other Apache bands, united by their common hatred of the Americans and their shared determination to resist. The general, however, was undeterred by the mounting casualties and the growing criticism of his methods. He believed that he was fighting a righteous war, a war to bring civilization to a savage land. He saw himself as a crusader, a man chosen by God to cleanse the Southwest of its heathen inhabitants. He was convinced that his harsh methods were not only justified, but necessary. "I have no doubt that the course I have pursued is the correct one," he wrote to his wife. "The Apache are a scourge upon the land, a blight upon civilization. They must be removed by whatever means necessary so that decent, God-fearing people can live in peace." But Carleton's war was taking its toll, not just on the Apache, but on his own forces. The soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly reluctant to carry out his orders. The cost of the campaign was enormous, draining the territorial treasury and straining the resources of the federal government. The criticism from Washington was growing louder, and there were calls for his removal. The Apache, meanwhile, were adapting to this new form of warfare. They learned to avoid the large military columns, to strike at isolated outposts, to use the vast and rugged terrain of the Southwest to their advantage. They became masters of guerrilla warfare, a phantom enemy that could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. The most effective of these Apache leaders was a man named Cochise, the Chiricahua chief whose family had been murdered in the Bascom affair. He had learned from the death of Mangas Coloradas that the Americans could not be trusted, that there would be no peace, no negotiation, only war. He had transformed himself from a diplomat into a warrior, and he was proving to be a formidable enemy. Cochise's stronghold was in the Dragoon Mountains of Arizona, a natural fortress of granite spires and hidden canyons that had been the home of his people for generations. From this base, he launched a series of raids that terrorized the entire territory. He struck at ranches, mines, and military outposts with a precision and ferocity that left the Americans reeling. The general sent expedition after expedition into the Dragoons, but they all returned empty-handed. Cochise was like a ghost, always one step ahead of his pursuers. He knew every trail, every waterhole, every hiding place in the mountains. He could move his people at a moment's notice, vanishing into the wilderness like smoke in the wind. Carleton's frustration was growing. He had promised his superiors that he would end the Apache problem within a year, but the war was dragging on with no end in sight. The Apache were not being defeated. They were becoming stronger, more united, more determined. His policy of extermination was not working. It was only making the enemy more dangerous. In desperation, Carleton began to employ even more brutal tactics. He offered bounties for Apache scalps, just as the Mexicans had done decades before. He authorized the use of poison in waterholes frequented by the Apache. He ordered the destruction of Apache food sources, burning their crops and killing their livestock. He was determined to starve them into submission, to make their very existence impossible. But the Apache endured. They had survived Spanish colonization, Mexican persecution, and now American extermination. They were a people forged by adversity, hardened by centuries of warfare, and they would not be broken. They continued to fight, to resist, to survive, even as their world crumbled around them. The war that Carleton had promised would last a year stretched into 2 years, then 3, then 4. The cost in blood and treasure was enormous, and the criticism of his methods was growing louder. There were calls for his removal, demands for a change in policy, pleas for a more humane approach to the Apache problem. But Carleton was a stubborn man, convinced of the righteousness of his cause. He refused to change his methods, refused to consider negotiation, refused to acknowledge that his policy was a failure. He was determined to see his war through to the bitter end, no matter what the cost. The Apache, meanwhile, were paying a terrible price for their resistance. Their numbers were dwindling, their resources were exhausted, and their people were suffering. But they continued to fight, driven by a love for their land and their freedom that was stronger than their fear of death. They were a people who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees, and they were proving it every day. The war that Carleton had started was becoming a nightmare, a conflict that was consuming everything in its path. It was a war that would define the Southwest for a generation, a war that would leave scars on the land and the people that would never heal. It was a war that would test the very soul of America, forcing the nation to confront the dark side of its expansion, the brutal cost of its manifest destiny. And in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest, the Apache continued to fight, their voices raised in defiance, their spirits unbroken, their determination unshaken. They were the last of the free peoples of America, and they would not go quietly into the night. Chapter 10. The Reservation System. By the late 1860s, the American government had begun to realize that Carleton's policy of extermination was not only morally reprehensible, but also practically impossible. The Apache were proving to be too resilient, too adaptable, and too determined to be simply wiped out. A new approach was needed, one that would remove the Apache from their traditional lands without the political embarrassment of outright genocide. The solution they devised was the reservation system, a policy that would prove to be almost as destructive as the war itself. The reservation system was based on a simple premise. The Apache would be confined to specific areas of land, usually the most barren and undesirable territories available, where they would be supervised by government agents and gradually civilized. They would be taught to farm, to speak English, to adopt Christianity, and to abandon their traditional ways of life. It was a policy of cultural genocide designed to destroy the Apache as a people while keeping them alive as individuals. The first and largest of these reservations was San Carlos, established in 1872 in the desert of eastern Arizona. It was a place of unimaginable desolation, a landscape of sagebrush and cactus, of scorching heat and bitter cold, of dust storms and flash floods. The Apache called it Hell's 40 Acres, and the name was apt. It was a place where different Apache bands, many of them traditional enemies, were thrown together in a volatile and explosive mix. It was a place of hunger, of disease, of despair. The man chosen to oversee this grand experiment in cultural destruction was John Clum, a young, idealistic Indian agent who believed that he could transform the Apache into model American citizens. Clum was a small, energetic man with a fierce determination and an unshakable faith in the superiority of American civilization. He was also a man who genuinely cared about the Apache people, even as he worked to destroy their culture. Clum's approach was paternalistic but relatively benevolent. He established a system of Apache police, using Apache men to maintain order on the reservation. He set up schools to teach Apache children to read and write in English. He encouraged the Apache to take up farming, even though the land at San Carlos was largely unsuitable for agriculture. He was, in his own mind, a great humanitarian, a man who was saving the Apache from themselves. But the Apache saw things differently. They were a nomadic people, accustomed to roaming freely across hundreds of thousands of square miles of desert and mountain. To be confined to a single reservation, no matter how large, was a form of imprisonment. They were a warrior culture, proud and independent, and to be reduced to the status of wards of the government was a humiliation that cut to the very core of their being. The conditions at San Carlos were appalling. The government rations were inadequate and often spoiled. The water was brackish and contaminated. Disease was rampant, and medical care was virtually non-existent. The Apache, who had once been the masters of their environment, were now dependent on the whims of government bureaucrats for their very survival. Many Apache tried to adapt to reservation life, but it was a struggle that few could win. The men who had once been warriors and hunters were now expected to become farmers, tilling soil that was often too poor to support crops. The women, who had once been the keepers of Apache traditions, were now expected to abandon their customs and adopt the ways of white women. The children were taken from their families and sent to government boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native language or practice their traditional religion. The psychological toll was enormous. Alcoholism became rampant among the Apache men, a way of escaping the reality of their situation. Suicide rates soared. Families were torn apart by the stress and despair of reservation life. The Apache, who had once been a proud and vibrant people, were being systematically destroyed, not by bullets and bayonets, but by bureaucracy and benevolence. Not all Apache accepted this fate. Many fled the reservations, returning to their traditional way of life in the mountains and deserts. They were hunted down by the army and forced to return, often at gunpoint. Those who resisted were killed or imprisoned. It was a cycle of escape and recapture that would continue for decades. The most famous of these reservation breakouts was led by Geronimo, the fierce Bedonkohe warrior who had become the symbol of Apache resistance. Between 1876 and 1886, Geronimo led his followers off the reservation 4 times, each escape triggering a massive military response. The army would pursue him into the mountains of Arizona and Mexico, using thousands of soldiers and Apache scouts to track down a band that never numbered more than a few dozen warriors. These breakouts were not just acts of rebellion, they were desperate attempts to preserve the Apache way of life. Geronimo and his followers were not trying to conquer territory or defeat the American army. They were simply trying to live as their ancestors had lived, free and independent in the land of their birth. But the American government could not tolerate even this limited form of resistance. Every Apache who left the reservation was seen as a threat to the entire system, a challenge to American authority that had to be crushed. The pursuit of Geronimo became a national obsession. Newspapers across the country followed every twist and turn of the chase, portraying the Apache leader as a bloodthirsty savage who threatened the safety of innocent settlers. The reality was far different. Geronimo's band was small and desperate, more concerned with survival than with warfare. They raided for food and supplies, not for conquest. They killed when they had to. But they were not the monsters that the press made them out to be. The Army's response was massive and disproportionate. General George Crook and later General Nelson Miles deployed thousands of troops in the pursuit of Geronimo. They used the latest in military technology, including the telegraph and the railroad, to coordinate their efforts. They employed Apache scouts, men who knew the land and the language of their quarry. They spent millions of dollars and years of effort to capture a handful of desperate fugitives. The irony was not lost on some observers. Here was the most powerful nation on Earth, with an army that had just won a civil war and was in the process of conquering the West, being held at bay by a small band of Apache warriors. It was a testament to the skill and determination of the Apache, but it was also a sign of the fundamental injustice of the reservation system. The reservation system was not just a failure, it was a tragedy. It destroyed the Apache way of life without providing a viable alternative. It created a generation of Apache who were caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. It turned proud warriors into dependent wards of the state, and it reduced a vibrant culture to a shadow of its former self. But the Apache endured. Despite the hardships, despite the humiliation, despite the systematic attempt to destroy their culture, they survived. They adapted to reservation life as best they could, preserving what they could of their traditions while learning to navigate the complex world of American bureaucracy. They sent their children to school, knowing that education was the key to survival in the new world that was being forced upon them. Some Apache found ways to thrive within the reservation system. They became successful farmers, businessmen, and professionals. They learned to use the American legal system to protect their rights and their land. They became advocates for their people, fighting for better conditions and greater autonomy. They proved that the Apache were not a dying race, but a people capable of adaptation and survival. The reservation system was supposed to be a temporary measure, a way station on the road to full assimilation into American society. But it became a permanent feature of Apache life, a form of internal colonialism that persists to this day. The reservations became homelands, places where Apache culture could be preserved and passed down to future generations. They became symbols of both oppression and resistance, reminders of what had been lost and what had been saved. The story of the Apache reservations is a complex one, filled with tragedy and triumph, with loss and survival. It is a story that continues to this day as the Apache people work to preserve their culture and their identity in a world that has changed beyond recognition. It is a story of a people who refused to disappear, who found ways to endure and to thrive despite the best efforts of their conquerors to destroy them. The reservation system was meant to be the final solution to the Apache problem, the end of the long and bloody conflict that had raged across the Southwest for decades. But it was not an end. It was a transformation. The Apache Wars had ended, but the struggle for Apache survival and identity had just begun. It was a struggle that would continue for generations, a struggle that continues to this day. Chapter 11. The Battle of Apache Pass. In the scorching heat of July 1862, as the Civil War raged in the distant East, a different kind of battle was about to unfold in the remote mountains of Arizona Territory. It would be one of the largest and most significant engagements of the Apache Wars, a clash that would demonstrate both the tactical brilliance of the Apache warriors and the devastating power of American military technology. This was the Battle of Apache Pass, a confrontation that would forever change the balance of power in the Southwest. The stage for this epic battle was set by the broader context of the Civil War. Confederate forces had briefly occupied much of the Southwest, including Tucson and Massilia, as part of their ambitious plan to create a Confederate corridor to the Pacific Ocean. But by the summer of 1862, Union forces from California, known as the California Column, were marching east to reclaim the territory for the United States. Leading this column was Colonel James Henry Carleton, the same man who would later become the architect of the brutal extermination policy against the Apache. But in July 1862, Carleton was focused on a different enemy, the Confederates. His immediate goal was to secure the vital transportation routes through Apache Pass, the natural corridor through the Chiricahua Mountains that connected Arizona to New Mexico. Apache Pass was more than just a geographical feature. It was the lifeline of the Southwest. The pass contained the only reliable source of water for hundreds of miles, making it an essential stop for travelers, traders, and military forces. The Butterfield Overland Mail had established a station there, and the pass had become a crucial link in the chain of communication and commerce that connected the East Coast to California. But Apache Pass was also the heart of Cochise's domain. The great Chiricahua chief had made the surrounding Dragoon Mountains his stronghold, and he had long controlled access to the vital water source. Since the Bascom affair the previous year, Cochise had been at war with the Americans, and he was not about to allow a large military force to pass through his territory unchallenged. Cochise was not alone in his determination to defend Apache Pass. He had been joined by his father-in-law, Mangas Coloradas, the towering chief of the Bidoncohe Apache. Mangas, despite being in his 70s, was still a formidable warrior and a brilliant military strategist. Together, these two great leaders had assembled the largest Apache war party in history, a force of over 500 warriors representing multiple bands and united by their common hatred of the white invaders. The Apache had been preparing for this confrontation for weeks. They had carefully studied the terrain, identifying the best positions for an ambush. They had stockpiled weapons and ammunition, including firearms captured in previous raids. They had even constructed stone breastworks on the hills overlooking the pass, turning the natural landscape into a fortress. This was not going to be a typical Apache hit-and-run raid. This was going to be a pitched battle, a decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of Apachería. On July 15, 1862, the advance guard of the California Column entered Apache Pass. It was a small force consisting of Company E of the 1st California, infantry under the command of Captain Thomas Roberts, along with a cavalry escort and 2 mountain howitzers. The soldiers were exhausted from their long march across the desert, and they were desperately in need of water. They had no idea that they were walking into the largest Apache ambush in history. As the soldiers made their way through the narrow confines of the pass, they seemed to be entering a landscape of eerie silence. The usual sounds of desert life, the call of birds, the rustle of small animals, were absent. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. The soldiers, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their canteens empty, pressed forward toward the life-giving spring that lay ahead. They had traveled about 2/3 of the way through the pass when the silence was shattered by the crack of rifle fire. From the hills on both sides of the narrow canyon, Apache warriors opened fire with a devastating volley that echoed off the rocky walls like thunder. The soldiers, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off the stones around them. Captain Roberts quickly assessed the situation and realized the desperate nature of their predicament. His men were trapped in a narrow canyon, surrounded by an enemy that held the high ground. They were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, and they were running dangerously low on water. A retreat back through the pass would be almost as dangerous as going forward, and it would leave them stranded in the desert without water. There was only one option. They had to fight their way through to the spring. The Apache had chosen their positions with the skill of master tacticians. They had constructed stone breastworks on the hills overlooking the pass, giving them excellent cover while providing clear fields of fire down into the canyon. They had positioned their best marksmen at key points, ensuring that every approach to the spring would be covered by deadly crossfire. They had even prepared fallback positions, allowing them to conduct a fighting withdrawal if necessary. The warriors themselves were a formidable sight. They had painted their faces for war, with bold strokes of red, black, and white that made them appear almost supernatural in the harsh desert light. They wore their hair tied up on top of their heads to keep it out of their eyes during battle, and many had adorned themselves with eagle feathers and other symbols of their warrior status. They were armed with a mixture of traditional weapons, bows, lances, and war clubs, and modern firearms captured in previous raids. Leading this formidable force were two of the greatest Apache leaders in history. Cochise, tall and imposing, moved among his warriors with the calm confidence of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His presence alone was enough to inspire his followers to fight with superhuman courage. Beside him was Mangas Coloradas, the Red Sleeves, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Despite his advanced age, the old chief was still a formidable warrior, and his tactical genius was evident in every aspect of the ambush. The battle that followed was unlike anything the American soldiers had ever experienced. The Apache fought with a ferocity and skill that stunned the veterans of the California Column. They used the terrain to their advantage, appearing and disappearing among the rocks like ghosts. They coordinated their attacks with a precision that spoke of careful planning and extensive preparation. They fought not just as individual warriors, but as a unified force with a common purpose. For the first hour of the battle, it seemed as if the Apache would achieve a complete victory. The American soldiers were pinned down in the bottom of the canyon, unable to advance or retreat. Several men had already been killed or wounded, and their ammunition was running low. The Apache, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere at once, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they poured a deadly fire down on the trapped soldiers. But Captain Roberts had one advantage that the Apache had not fully anticipated: artillery. The two mountain howitzers that accompanied his force were small, portable cannons designed for use in rough terrain. They were not particularly powerful by the standards of Civil War artillery, but they were devastating against an enemy that had never faced such weapons before. Roberts ordered his men to unlimber the howitzers and prepare them for action. It was a dangerous maneuver, requiring the soldiers to expose themselves to Apache fire while they positioned the guns. Several men were hit during this process, but they continued to work with grim determination, knowing that their lives depended on getting the cannons into action. The first shot from the howitzers was like a thunderclap in the confined space of the canyon. The shell exploded among the Apache positions on the hillside, sending up a shower of rock and dust. The warriors, who had never experienced artillery fire before, were stunned by the power and noise of the weapons. Some of them had never even seen a cannon, and the sight of the wagons that shoot, as they called them, filled them with a mixture of awe and terror. But the Apache were not easily intimidated. They quickly adapted to this new threat, spreading out to minimize the effect of the artillery and continuing to pour fire down on the American positions. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Apache held the high ground and had superior numbers, but the Americans had superior firepower and the desperate motivation of men fighting for their lives. As the day wore on, the tide of battle began to turn. The howitzers, despite their small size, were having a devastating effect on the Apache positions. The exploding shells were not only killing and wounding warriors, but they were also destroying the carefully constructed stone breastworks that had given the Apache such an advantage. The psychological effect was even greater than the physical damage, as the constant explosions shattered the nerves of warriors who had never faced such weapons. Mangas Coloradas, the great chief who had led his people in countless battles against the Mexicans and Americans, was wounded during the artillery barrage. A shell fragment struck him in the chest, and he was forced to withdraw from the battle. His wounding was a severe blow to Apache morale, as the old chief was not only a great leader, but also a symbol of Apache resistance. As night fell, the Apache began to withdraw from their positions. They had fought with incredible courage and skill, but they had been outgunned by the American artillery. The warriors melted away into the darkness, carrying their wounded with them, and leaving the Americans in control of the pass. It was a tactical victory for the United States, but it had come at a terrible cost. The casualties from the Battle of Apache Pass were relatively light by Civil War standards, but they were significant for the Apache Wars. The Americans lost 2 men killed and several wounded, while Apache casualties were much higher. According to some accounts, as many as 60 Apache warriors were killed or wounded in the battle, though the exact number will never be known. More important than the immediate casualties was the long-term impact of the battle. The Apache had learned a harsh lesson about the power of American military technology. They had discovered that their traditional tactics, which had served them so well against Mexican forces and small American patrols, were inadequate against a well-equipped and determined enemy. The age of the great Apache war parties was coming to an end, and the future would belong to small bands of guerrilla fighters who could strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could bring their superior firepower to bear. For the Americans, the Battle of Apache Pass was a wake-up call. They had won the engagement, but they had also learned that the Apache were formidable enemies who would not be easily defeated. The battle demonstrated that controlling the Southwest would require a sustained military effort and a significant commitment of resources. It also showed that the Apache were capable of coordinating large-scale military operations, making them a more dangerous enemy than many had previously believed. The immediate result of the battle was the establishment of Fort Bowie, a military post built to guard Apache Pass and ensure American control of this vital transportation route. The fort was named after Colonel George Washington Bowie of the 5th California Infantry, and it would become one of the most important military installations in the Southwest. From this base, American forces would launch countless expeditions against the Apache over the next 2 decades. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Battle of Apache Pass was its effect on the Apache themselves. The defeat marked the beginning of the end of the great Apache Confederacy that Cochise and Mangas Coloradas had built. The unity that had been forged in the aftermath of the Bascom affair began to fracture as different bands pursued different strategies for survival. Some chose to continue the fight, while others sought accommodation with the Americans. The age of the great Apache war chiefs was drawing to a close, and the future would belong to men like Geronimo, who would wage a different kind of war, a war of shadows and raids, of desperate survival rather than glorious victory. The Battle of Apache Pass was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point in the history of the American West. It marked the moment when the full power of the United States was brought to bear against the Apache people, and it foreshadowed the long and bloody conflict that would follow. It was a battle that demonstrated both the courage of the Apache warriors and the inexorable advance of American civilization. It was a battle that would be remembered long after the last shot was fired, a battle that would echo through the canyons and mountains of the Southwest for generations to come. Chapter 12. The Way of the Warrior. To understand the Apache Wars, one must first understand the Apache warrior. These were not simply men who fought. They were the products of a culture that had been shaped by centuries of warfare, a people for whom combat was not just a necessity, but a sacred calling. The Apache warrior was the culmination of a lifetime of training, ritual, and spiritual preparation, a human weapon forged in the crucible of the harsh southwestern landscape. The making of an Apache warrior began in childhood. Boys were taught from an early age that they were born to fight, that their destiny was to defend their people and their land against all enemies. They learned to run for miles without rest, to go without food or water for days, to endure pain without complaint. They were taught to read the signs of the desert, to track animals and enemies across rocky ground, to move silently through the brush. They learned to use the bow and arrow, the lance, and the war club with deadly precision. But physical training was only part of the preparation. The Apache warrior was also a spiritual being, a man who drew his power from the supernatural world. He underwent elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to give him protection in battle and to ensure his success in war. He painted his face and body with sacred symbols, wore amulets and charms, and carried medicine bundles that contained objects of spiritual power. He sang war songs that had been passed down through generations, songs that were believed to make him invisible to his enemies or to turn their bullets aside. The Apache warrior was also bound by a complex code of honor and behavior. He was expected to be brave in battle, generous to his people, and loyal to his band. He was forbidden to show fear or to retreat from a fight unless ordered to do so by his leader. He was expected to avenge any wrong done to his family or his people, even if it meant his own death. He was a man who lived by a code that valued honor above life, courage above comfort, and freedom above all else. The weapons of the Apache warrior were as varied as they were deadly. The traditional weapon was the bow, a powerful composite bow made from mulberry wood and sinew that could drive an arrow through a man's body at 100 yards. The arrows themselves were works of art, carefully crafted with points made from obsidian, flint, or metal, and fletched with eagle feathers for accuracy and speed. A skilled Apache archer could loose 12 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload his rifle, and he could hit a target the size of a man's head at distances that would challenge a modern marksman. The lance was another favored weapon, a long spear tipped with a razor-sharp point that could be used from horseback or on foot. The Apache warrior was a master of mounted combat, able to guide his horse with his knees while wielding his lance with deadly precision. He could ride at full gallop and strike a target with pinpoint accuracy, then wheel away before his enemy could react. The war club was the weapon of close combat, a heavy, blunt instrument that could crush a skull or break bones with a single blow. It was often decorated with feathers, beads, and other ornaments that marked the warrior's achievements in battle. Some war clubs were fitted with metal spikes or blades, making them even more deadly in hand-to-hand combat. As the Apache came into contact with Europeans and Americans, they quickly adopted firearms, becoming skilled marksmen with rifles and pistols. But they never abandoned their traditional weapons, understanding that in the harsh environment of the Southwest, a bow and arrow might be more reliable than a gun that could jam or run out of ammunition. The Apache warrior was also a master of camouflage and concealment. He could blend into the landscape so completely that he seemed to become part of it. He wore clothing made from the hides of desert animals, dyed with natural pigments that matched the colors of the rocks and vegetation. He moved with a fluid grace that made no sound, leaving no trace of his passage. He could lie motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The tactics of Apache warfare were as sophisticated as they were effective. The Apache did not fight in the European style, with massed formations and frontal assaults. Instead, they relied on speed, stealth, and surprise. They would strike without warning, inflict maximum damage, and then disappear before their enemies could organize a response. They were masters of the ambush, the raid, and the running fight. The Apache war party was a highly organized and disciplined unit despite its small size. Each warrior had a specific role to play, and each knew exactly what was expected of him. The leader, usually an experienced war chief, would plan the operation in detail, taking into account the terrain, the weather, the strength of the enemy, and the objectives of the mission. He would assign specific tasks to each warrior, ensuring that every aspect of the operation was covered. The war party would travel light, carrying only the essentials: weapons, ammunition, a small amount of food, and water. They would move at night when possible, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. They would communicate with hand signals or bird calls, maintaining absolute silence when necessary. They would strike at dawn or dusk when their enemies were least alert, and they would be gone before the sun was fully up or completely down. The Apache warrior was also a master of psychological warfare. He understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as any arrow or bullet. He would use war paint and ritual scarification to make himself appear more fearsome. He would emit blood-curdling war cries that could freeze the blood of his enemies. He would mutilate the bodies of his victims in ways designed to terrorize those who found them. He would leave signs and symbols that would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, letting them know that the Apache were watching, waiting, ready to strike. But the Apache warrior was not a mindless killer. He was a thinking, feeling human being who fought for reasons that were deeply personal and profoundly important to him. He fought to protect his family, his people, and his way of life. He fought to defend the land that his ancestors had given him, the sacred places where his people had lived and died for generations. He fought for freedom, for the right to live according to the customs and traditions of his people. The Apache warrior was also a man of great spiritual depth. He believed that he was part of a larger cosmic order, that his actions in this world had consequences in the spirit world. He performed elaborate rituals before going to war, seeking the blessing of the spirits and the protection of his ancestors. He carried sacred objects that connected him to the supernatural world, and he followed taboos and restrictions that were designed to maintain his spiritual power. The training of an Apache warrior was a lifelong process that began in childhood and continued until death. Young boys would accompany war parties as apprentices, learning the skills and traditions of warfare by observation and practice. They would start by tending the horses and carrying supplies, gradually taking on more responsibility as they proved themselves worthy. They would undergo initiation ceremonies that marked their transition from boys to warriors, rituals that tested their courage, endurance, and commitment to their people. The Apache warrior was also expected to be a provider for his people. When not engaged in warfare, he would hunt game, gather food, and protect the camp from wild animals and other dangers. He was a man of many skills, able to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth with nothing but his wits and his weapons. The social status of the Apache warrior was determined not by birth or wealth, but by his achievements in battle. A man who had proven himself in combat was respected and honored by his people. He would be given a place of honor in the council. His advice would be sought on matters of war and peace, and his name would be remembered in the songs and stories of his people. The Apache warrior was also bound by a complex system of kinship and clan relationships that determined his obligations and loyalties. He was expected to avenge any wrong done to a member of his clan, even if it meant going to war against overwhelming odds. He was also expected to share his wealth and his success with his relatives, ensuring that no member of his extended family went hungry or lacked protection. The decline of the Apache warrior was not just a military defeat, it was a cultural catastrophe. As the Apache were forced onto reservations and their traditional way of life was destroyed, the role of the warrior became obsolete. Young men who had been trained from birth to be fighters found themselves with no outlet for their skills and no way to achieve the status and respect that had once been theirs by right. The transformation of the Apache warrior from a proud and independent fighter to a dependent ward of the government was one of the great tragedies of the American West. It was the destruction of a way of life that had existed for centuries, the end of a culture that had produced some of the finest warriors the world had ever known. But the spirit of the Apache warrior did not die with the end of the Apache Wars. It lived on in the stories and songs of the Apache people, in the memories of the old men who had fought in the last battles, in the dreams of the young men who wished they had been born in a different time. It lived on in the pride and dignity of a people who had never been truly conquered, who had fought to the end for their freedom and their way of life. The Apache warrior was more than just a fighter. He was the embodiment of a people's will to survive, their refusal to be broken or defeated. He was a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the unquenchable human desire for freedom. He was a man who would rather die on his feet than live on his knees, and in that choice, he achieved a kind of immortality that no defeat could destroy. Chapter 13. The Apache Kid. In the twilight years of the Apache Wars, when most of the great chiefs had been killed or captured, when the reservations had become prisons and the old ways seemed destined for extinction, there emerged one last figure who would embody the dying spirit of Apache resistance. He was known as the Apache Kid, and his story is perhaps the most tragic and mysterious of all the tales from this bloody period of American history. The Apache Kid was born around 1860 in the final years of the free Apache way of life. His Apache name was Haske Bay Naintail, which meant the tall man destined to come to a mysterious end. It was a prophetic name, for the Apache Kid would indeed meet a fate that remains shrouded in mystery to this day. He was a member of the White Mountain Apache, one of the bands that had been forced onto the San Carlos Reservation in the 1870s. Unlike the great war chiefs who had come before him, the Apache Kid was a product of two worlds. He had grown up during the transition period when the Apache were being forced to abandon their traditional way of life and adapt to the white man's world. He spoke English fluently, had attended the government school at San Carlos, and had even worked as a scout for the U.S. Army. He was, in many ways, the kind of civilized Indian that the government's assimilation policies were designed to create. But the Apache Kid was also a man caught between two cultures, belonging fully to neither. He had learned the white man's ways, but he had never forgotten the traditions of his people. He had served the U.S. Army faithfully, but he had never stopped being an Apache warrior at heart. He was a man torn between loyalty to his employers and loyalty to his people, between the promise of assimilation and the pull of his ancestral heritage. The Apache Kid's transformation from government scout to outlaw began with a family tragedy that would have been familiar to any Apache of his generation. In 1887, his father was killed in a dispute with another Apache. According to Apache custom, the son was obligated to avenge his father's death, regardless of the consequences. It was a sacred duty, a matter of honor that transcended any loyalty to the white man's law. The Apache Kid fulfilled his obligation, killing the man who had murdered his father. But in doing so, he violated the white man's law and became a fugitive from justice. He was arrested and tried for murder, but he escaped from custody before he could be sentenced. From that moment on, he was a hunted man, pursued by the same army that had once employed him as a scout. What followed was a cat-and-mouse game that would last for years. The Apache Kid, using all the skills he had learned as a scout and all the knowledge he had gained of both Apache and white ways, became a master of evasion. He could disappear into the wilderness like a ghost, only to reappear hundreds of miles away, striking at isolated ranches or travelers before vanishing again into the vast expanse of the Southwest. The pursuit of the Apache Kid became an obsession for the U.S. Army and the territorial authorities. He represented everything they feared about the Apache. He was intelligent, resourceful, and completely unpredictable. He knew their methods because he had once been one of them, and he used that knowledge against them with devastating effect. He was the perfect guerrilla fighter, a man who could strike anywhere at any time and then disappear without a trace. The Apache Kid's band was never large. At most, he led a dozen followers, men who had chosen to follow him into exile rather than submit to reservation life. They were the last of the free Apaches, the final remnant of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. They lived off the land, raiding for supplies when necessary, always moving, always one step ahead of their pursuers. The crimes attributed to the Apache Kid and his followers were numerous and brutal. They were blamed for dozens of murders, countless thefts, and raids that terrorized the entire Southwest. Some of these crimes were undoubtedly committed by the Apache Kid's band, but many others were probably the work of other outlaws who found it convenient to let the Apache Kid take the blame. He had become a convenient scapegoat, a symbol of all the violence and lawlessness that plagued the frontier. The manhunt for the Apache Kid involved hundreds of soldiers, lawmen, and civilian volunteers. Rewards were offered for his capture, dead or alive, and bounty hunters scoured the mountains and deserts of Arizona and New Mexico in search of him. But the Apache Kid seemed to lead a charmed life, always managing to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. Part of the Apache Kid's success lay in his intimate knowledge of the terrain. He knew every waterhole, every hidden canyon, every secret trail in the vast wilderness of the Southwest. He could travel for days without leaving a trace, moving across rocky ground that would defeat the best trackers. He could survive on foods that would poison a white man, and he could go without water for periods that would kill an ordinary person. But the Apache Kid's greatest advantage was his understanding of both cultures. He knew how the army thought, how they would react to his movements, what tactics they would use to try to capture him. He had been trained by them, and he used that training against them. At the same time, he retained all the skills and knowledge of his Apache heritage, the ancient wisdom that had allowed his people to survive in the harsh environment of the Southwest for centuries. The Apache Kid also benefited from the sympathy and support of many reservation Apaches. Despite the risks involved, some of them provided him with information, supplies, and shelter. They saw him as a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the days when the Apache were free and proud. To them, he was not an outlaw, but a hero, a man who had chosen freedom over security, honor over comfort. The authorities, frustrated by their inability to capture the Apache Kid, began to employ increasingly harsh tactics. They arrested and imprisoned Apache who were suspected of helping him, often without evidence. They offered rewards for information leading to his capture, turning Apache against Apache. They even considered using poison gas to flush him out of the caves where he was believed to be hiding. As the years passed, the Apache Kid became more legend than man. Stories of his exploits grew in the telling, and he was credited with superhuman abilities. Some said he could become invisible at will, others that he could fly like a bird or run faster than a horse. He was said to have the power to see into the future, to know when his enemies were coming before they knew it themselves. The truth was probably more mundane, but no less remarkable. The Apache Kid was simply a man who had been pushed to the breaking point, who had chosen to live and die as a free Apache rather than submit to the degradation of reservation life. He was the last of his kind, the final representative of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the American West. The end of the Apache Kid's story is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts say he was killed in a shootout with Mexican soldiers in the Sierra Madre mountains of Mexico. Others claim he was murdered by bounty hunters who never collected their reward because they could never prove they had killed the right man. Still others insist that he lived to old age, dying peacefully in some remote canyon, his identity known only to a few trusted friends. The most likely scenario is that the Apache Kid was killed sometime in the early 1890s, probably in Mexico, where he had fled to escape the relentless pursuit of American authorities. But his body was never found, and his death was never confirmed, which only added to his legend. For years afterward, every unsolved crime in the Southwest was attributed to the Apache Kid, and sightings of him were reported long after he was almost certainly dead. The story of the Apache Kid is more than just the tale of one man's resistance to authority. It is the story of a people's struggle to maintain their identity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. It is the story of the conflict between two very different concepts of justice, honor, and duty. It is the story of what happens when an individual is caught between two worlds and finds that he belongs fully to neither. The Apache Kid represented the end of an era, the final chapter in the long and bloody history of the Apache Wars. He was the last of the free Apaches, the final symbol of a people's refusal to be conquered. His story is a reminder that the conquest of the American West was not just a matter of military victory, but also a cultural catastrophe that destroyed entire ways of life. In the end, the Apache Kid became what he had always been destined to become: a mystery, a legend, a symbol of resistance that could never be fully captured or destroyed. He had achieved a kind of immortality that no prison could contain and no bullet could kill. He had become the embodiment of the Apache spirit, the living reminder of a people who had once been free and who had never truly been conquered. The Apache Kid's legacy lives on in the stories and songs of the Apache people, in the memories of those who knew him, and in the imagination of all who hear his tale. He was the last of the Apache warriors, the final guardian of a way of life that had existed for centuries and that died with him in some unknown place, at some unknown time, in the vast and lonely wilderness of the American Southwest. Chapter 14. The Women Warriors. In the male-dominated narrative of the Apache Wars, the stories of Apache women have often been overlooked or relegated to footnotes. Yet these women played crucial roles in the conflict, not merely as victims or passive observers, but as active participants who fought, led, and died alongside their men. Their stories reveal a different dimension of the Apache Wars, one that challenges our understanding of gender roles in warfare and illuminates the full scope of Apache resistance. Apache society, unlike many other Native American cultures, accorded women a relatively high status. Women owned property, had a voice in tribal councils, and could even become war leaders under certain circumstances. They were the keepers of Apache traditions, the ones who passed down the stories, songs, and customs that defined Apache identity. They were also the backbone of Apache survival, responsible for gathering food, making clothing, and maintaining the camps that served as bases for the warriors. But when war came, Apache women did not simply retreat to the safety of the camps. Many of them took up arms and fought alongside their husbands, brothers, and sons. They were skilled with traditional weapons like the bow and arrow, and they quickly learned to use firearms when they became available. They were expert horsewomen, capable of riding and fighting with the same skill as the men. They were also masters of the guerrilla tactics that made the Apache such formidable opponents. The most famous of these women warriors was Lozan, the sister of the great Warm Springs Apache chief Victorio. Lozan was said to possess supernatural powers, including the ability to locate enemies by holding her hands up to the sky and feeling the direction from which danger approached. She was also a skilled warrior and strategist, respected by both men and women for her courage and wisdom. She fought in many of the major battles of Victorio's war, and after her brother's death, she joined Geronimo's band and continued to fight until the final surrender in 1886. Lozan was not unique among Apache women. There were many others who took up arms and fought for their people's freedom. There was Datest, a Chihene woman who served as a messenger and scout for Geronimo's band. She was fluent in several languages and could move freely between different Apache groups, carrying information and coordinating resistance activities. She was also a skilled fighter, capable of holding her own in battle against any enemy. There was also Siki, a Chiricahua woman who fought alongside her husband in many raids and battles. She was known for her marksmanship and her ability to remain calm under fire. She was captured several times by American forces, but always managed to escape, often taking other prisoners with her. She was a symbol of Apache defiance, a woman who refused to be broken by captivity or intimidation. These women warriors were not aberrations or exceptions to the rule. They were part of a long tradition of Apache women who had taken up arms when their people were threatened. Apache oral history is filled with stories of women who fought against Spanish conquistadors, Mexican soldiers, and American troops. They were the daughters and granddaughters of women who had defended their homes and families against all comers. The role of Apache women in warfare was not limited to combat. They also served as spies, messengers, and intelligence gatherers. They could move more freely than men in certain situations, using their supposed non-combatant status to gather information about enemy movements and plans. They were often the ones who warned Apache bands of approaching danger, allowing the warriors to prepare ambushes or escape to safety. Apache women were also responsible for maintaining the logistical support that made Apache warfare possible. They prepared food for the war parties, made and repaired weapons and equipment, and cared for the wounded. They managed the camps and kept the families together while the men were away fighting. They were the ones who ensured that there would be something to come back to when the warriors returned from their raids. The capture and treatment of Apache women by American forces was one of the most controversial aspects of the Apache Wars. Many women and children were taken prisoner during raids and battles, and their fate was often uncertain. Some were held as hostages to force the surrender of Apache warriors. Others were sent to distant reservations or even sold into slavery in Mexico. The threat to their women and children was one of the factors that drove Apache men to fight with such desperate ferocity. The story of Apache women during the wars is also a story of incredible endurance and survival. They lived through conditions that would have broken many people, enduring hunger, thirst, exposure, and constant danger. They gave birth to children in caves and hidden canyons, raised families while constantly on the move, and maintained their cultural traditions even as their world was being destroyed around them. One of the most remarkable aspects of Apache women's participation in the wars was their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As the conflict evolved from large-scale battles to guerrilla warfare, women found new ways to contribute to the resistance. They became experts at concealment and evasion, able to hide entire families in places where pursuing soldiers could not find them. They developed new techniques for preserving food and water, essential skills for people who might have to survive for weeks in the wilderness. Apache women also played a crucial role in maintaining morale and unity among the resistance fighters. They were the ones who sang the war songs that inspired the warriors before battle, who performed the ceremonies that gave spiritual protection to the fighters, who told the stories that reminded everyone what they were fighting for. They were the keepers of Apache identity, the ones who ensured that the culture would survive, even if the people did not. The end of the Apache Wars brought new challenges for Apache women. On the reservations, they found their traditional roles and status undermined by government policies designed to impose white American gender norms. They were expected to become farmers' wives, to abandon their traditional crafts and customs, to raise their children according to white American standards. Many resisted these changes, finding ways to preserve their traditions and pass them on to their children despite official disapproval. The women who had fought in the wars faced particular challenges. They were often viewed with suspicion by government officials who saw them as potentially dangerous influences on the reservation. Some, like Lawson and DeTesta, were imprisoned or closely monitored. Others found ways to blend back into reservation life, their warrior past hidden but not forgotten. The legacy of Apache women warriors extends far beyond the Apache Wars themselves. They challenged stereotypes about women's roles in warfare and demonstrated that courage and military skill are not limited by gender. They showed that the defense of home and family could motivate women to fight just as fiercely as men. They proved that women could be effective leaders and strategists, capable of making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. The stories of these women also reveal the full human cost of the Apache Wars. This was not just a conflict between armies, but a struggle that involved entire communities, including women and children. The Apache women who fought in these wars were not just defending territory or abstract principles. They were fighting for their families, their culture, and their way of life. Today, the memory of Apache women warriors is preserved in the oral traditions of the Apache people and in the growing body of historical research that seeks to tell their stories. They are remembered not just as victims of war, but as active participants who shaped the course of events through their courage, skill, and determination. They are symbols of resistance and survival, reminders that the human spirit can endure even the most terrible circumstances. The Apache women warriors were part of a larger tradition of Native American women who took up arms to defend their people. From Pocahontas to Sacagawea to the women who fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Native American women have played active roles in the conflicts that shaped American history. The Apache women warriors stand out even in this distinguished company for their skill, courage, and determination. Their stories also remind us that history is often more complex and nuanced than the simple narratives we sometimes tell ourselves. The Apache Wars were not just a story of male warriors fighting male soldiers. They were a complex conflict that involved entire communities, including women who were willing to fight and die for their beliefs. These women deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to history, but as central figures in one of the most important conflicts in American history. The Apache women warriors were the unsung heroes of the Apache Wars, the ones who fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival and freedom. They were mothers and daughters, wives and sisters, who took up arms when their world was threatened. They were the guardians of Apache culture, the ones who ensured that something of the old ways would survive even in defeat. They were warriors in the truest sense of the word, and their stories deserve to be told and remembered for generations to come. Chapter 15. The Gray Fox. Among all the American military leaders who fought in the Apache Wars, none was more respected by both his own men and his Apache enemies than General George Crook. Known to the Apache as Nantan Lupan, the Gray Fox, Crook was a complex figure who combined military brilliance with a genuine understanding of and respect for his Apache adversaries. His story is one of the most fascinating chapters in the long and bloody history of the Apache Wars. George Crook was born in Ohio in 1828, the son of a farmer who had fought in the War of 1812. From an early age, Crook showed an aptitude for military life and a fascination with the frontier. He graduated from West Point in 1852, ranking near the bottom of his class academically, but showing promise as a natural leader and tactician. His first assignment was to the Pacific Northwest, where he cut his teeth fighting the Rogue River Indians in Oregon and California. It was in these early campaigns that Crook developed the unconventional tactics that would later make him famous. He quickly realized that traditional military methods were ineffective against Native American warriors who refused to fight pitched battles and instead relied on guerrilla tactics. Crook adapted his approach, learning to fight fire with fire. He began using Native American scouts and allies, adopting their methods of warfare and showing a respect for their culture that was unusual among military officers of his era. Crook's first encounter with the Apache came in 1871 when he was assigned to command the Department of Arizona. The territory was in chaos, with Apache raids terrorizing settlers and the previous military commanders having achieved little success in stopping them. Crook arrived to find a demoralized army, frustrated civilians, and a seemingly intractable problem that had defied solution for decades. But Crook was not like his predecessors. Where they had relied on large, cumbersome columns of soldiers who could be easily detected and avoided by Apache scouts, Crook organized small, mobile units that could move quickly and strike without warning. Where they had tried to fight the Apache on their own terms using conventional military tactics, Crook learned to fight like an Apache, using stealth, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Most controversially, Crook began recruiting Apache scouts to fight against other Apache. This decision was met with fierce criticism from many quarters, with critics arguing that it was dishonorable to turn Apache against Apache. But Crook understood something that his critics did not. The Apache were not a monolithic people, but a collection of different bands and tribes, many of whom had been enemies long before the white man arrived. By exploiting these existing divisions and offering Apache scouts the chance to fight their traditional enemies while serving the U.S. Army, Crook was able to turn the Apache's greatest strength, their knowledge of the terrain and their fighting skills, against them. The Apache scouts proved to be invaluable. They could track other Apache across terrain that would baffle white soldiers. They could move silently through country that would betray the presence of a conventional military unit, and they could think like their quarry because they were their quarry. Under Crook's leadership, these Apache scouts became some of the most effective soldiers in the U.S. Army, feared and respected by both their enemies and their allies. Crook's first major success came in the winter of 1872 to 1873, when he launched a series of coordinated attacks against Apache strongholds in the Tonto Basin of central Arizona. Using his Apache scouts to locate the enemy camps and his mobile columns to strike them, Crook achieved what no previous commander had been able to do. He forced the Apache to fight on his terms. The campaign was brutal and relentless, with Crook's forces pursuing the Apache through some of the most rugged terrain in North America. The climax of the campaign came at the Battle of Salt River Canyon, where Crook's forces, led by Apache scouts, surprised a large Apache camp and inflicted heavy casualties. The Apache, caught off guard and unable to escape, were forced to surrender. It was a decisive victory that broke the back of Apache resistance in central Arizona and established Crook's reputation as the most effective Indian fighter in the U.S. Army. But Crook's success was not just due to his military tactics. He also understood the importance of treating his Apache prisoners and scouts with respect and dignity. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed all Apache as savage enemies to be exterminated, Crook recognized that they were human beings with their own culture, traditions, and sense of honor. He kept his promises to them, treated them fairly, and earned their respect in return. This approach paid dividends when Crook was called upon to negotiate with Apache leaders. His reputation for honesty and fair dealing preceded him, and many Apache chiefs who would not trust other white officials were willing to meet with the Gray Fox. Crook's negotiations with Apache leaders were often conducted in the Apache manner, with long discussions, careful consideration of all viewpoints, and a genuine attempt to find solutions that would benefit both sides. One of Crook's most significant achievements was his relationship with the great Apache chief Cochise. The two men, despite being enemies, developed a mutual respect that transcended the conflict between their peoples. Cochise recognized in Crook a worthy adversary, a man who fought with honor and treated his enemies with dignity. Crook, for his part, admired Cochise's military genius and his unwavering commitment to his people. Their relationship culminated in a series of negotiations that led to a temporary peace between Cochise's Chiricahua Apache and the U.S. government. The agreement allowed Cochise and his people to remain in their traditional homeland in the Dragoon Mountains in exchange for a promise to cease raiding. It was a remarkable achievement, one that demonstrated Crook's ability to find diplomatic solutions to seemingly intractable military problems. Crook's methods were not without controversy. His use of Apache scouts was criticized by many as dishonorable and potentially dangerous. There were concerns that the scouts might turn on their white commanders or that they might use their positions to gather intelligence for hostile Apache bands. Some critics argued that Crook was simply postponing the inevitable, that the Apache problem could only be solved through complete military victory and the removal of all Apache from their traditional lands. But Crook's approach was vindicated by results. Under his command, the Apache Wars in Arizona were largely brought to an end, with most Apache bands either surrendering or agreeing to live peacefully on reservations. The territory, which had been in a state of constant warfare for decades, finally experienced a period of relative peace and stability. Crook's success in Arizona led to his promotion and transfer to other commands, but he would return to fight the Apache again in the 1880s, when Geronimo and his followers broke out from the San Carlos Reservation and resumed their war against the United States. This second campaign would prove to be even more challenging than the first, as Crook found himself pursuing a smaller, more elusive enemy who had learned from previous defeats and adapted their tactics accordingly. The pursuit of Geronimo tested all of Crook's skills as a military commander and diplomat. Geronimo was a master of guerrilla warfare, able to strike without warning and disappear into the vast wilderness of the Southwest. He was also a charismatic leader who inspired fierce loyalty among his followers, making it difficult for Crook to exploit divisions within the Apache ranks as he had done in previous campaigns. Crook's campaign against Geronimo was marked by a series of frustrating near misses and temporary successes. His forces would track Geronimo's band for weeks, only to have them slip away at the last moment. They would negotiate temporary surrenders, only to have Geronimo change his mind and flee back to the mountains. It was a cat-and-mouse game that tested the patience and endurance of both sides. The climax of Crook's second Apache campaign came in March 1886, when he finally succeeded in arranging a meeting with Geronimo at Cañón de los Embudos, just south of the Mexican border. The negotiations were tense and difficult, with Geronimo suspicious of American promises and Crook frustrated by the Apache leader's refusal to surrender unconditionally. After days of talks, Geronimo finally agreed to surrender, but with conditions that Crook found difficult to accept. The Apache leader wanted guarantees that he and his followers would not be executed, that they would be allowed to return to their families, and that they would be treated with dignity and respect. Crook, operating under strict orders from Washington, was unable to make such promises. The negotiations ultimately broke down, and Geronimo fled back to the mountains with a small band of followers. Crook, frustrated and feeling that he had been undermined by his superiors in Washington, requested to be relieved of his command. His request was granted, and he was replaced by General Nelson Miles, who would ultimately succeed in capturing Geronimo using very different methods. Crook's departure from the Apache Wars marked the end of an era. He had been the most successful American commander in the conflict, the man who had come closest to finding a lasting solution to the Apache problem. His methods, based on respect for his enemies and a willingness to adapt to their tactics, had achieved more success than the brutal policies of extermination favored by some of his contemporaries. But Crook's legacy extended beyond his military achievements. He had demonstrated that it was possible to fight a war with honor, to treat one's enemies with dignity and respect even while seeking to defeat them. He had shown that understanding and respecting one's adversaries could be more effective than simply trying to destroy them. He had proven that military success did not require the abandonment of moral principles. Crook's relationship with the Apache was complex and sometimes contradictory. He was their enemy, the man who had defeated them in battle and forced them onto reservations. But he was also their protector, the man who had treated them fairly and kept his promises to them. Many Apache respected him even as they fought against him, recognizing in him a worthy adversary who understood the warrior's code. After his departure from Arizona, Crook continued to serve in the U.S. Army, commanding the Department of the Platte and dealing with other Native American conflicts. He remained an advocate for fair treatment of Native Americans, arguing that they should be given the same rights and opportunities as other American citizens. He was a voice of moderation in an era when many Americans favored harsh policies toward Native peoples. Crook died in 1890, just 4 years after his final encounter with Geronimo. His death was mourned not only by his fellow soldiers, but also by many of the Apache who had fought against him. They recognized that they had lost not just an enemy, but a man who had understood and respected them in a way that few white men ever had. The legacy of the Gray Fox lives on in the history of the American West. He was a man who had found a way to fight with honor in a dishonorable war, who had shown that it was possible to be both a successful military commander and a decent human being. He had demonstrated that understanding one's enemies could be more effective than simply trying to destroy them, and that respect and dignity could coexist with military necessity. George Crook was not a perfect man, and his methods were not without their critics. But in the brutal and often senseless conflict that was the Apache Wars, he stood out as a figure of relative honor and decency. He was the Gray Fox, the man who had earned the respect of both his friends and his enemies, and his story remains one of the most compelling chapters in the long and tragic history of the American frontier. Chapter 16. The Final Surrender. The summer of 1886 was a time of endings. Across the American West, the great age of the frontier was drawing to a close. The buffalo herds had been slaughtered, the railroads had connected the coasts, and the last of the free Indian tribes were being forced onto reservations. In the mountains and deserts of the Southwest, the final act of the Apache Wars was about to unfold, a drama that would end with the surrender of the Apache most famous Apache warrior of all, Geronimo. Geronimo was tired. At 67 years old, he had been fighting the white man for more than 3 decades. He had seen his people decimated by disease and warfare, his homeland carved up by invisible lines on maps drawn by men who had never set foot in Apachería. He had watched as the great chiefs of his youth, Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, Victorio, had died or been killed, leaving him as one of the last links to the old ways, the free ways, the Apache ways. His band was small now, never more than 38 people, including women and children. They were the last of the free Apache, the final holdouts against the inexorable advance of American civilization. They lived like ghosts in the wilderness, appearing suddenly to strike at isolated ranches or military patrols, then vanishing into the vast emptiness of the Sierra Madre mountains that straddled the border between Arizona and Mexico. The man charged with capturing Geronimo was General Nelson Miles, a career soldier who had replaced the respected George Crook after the Gray Fox's final negotiations with Geronimo had failed. Miles was a different kind of commander than Crook, more conventional in his methods, less willing to treat with the Apache as equals. He believed in the application of overwhelming force, in the use of modern technology and superior numbers to crush his enemies. Miles deployed over 5,000 troops in the pursuit of Geronimo's tiny band, 1/4 of the entire U.S. Army at the time. He established a network of heliograph stations across the Southwest, using mirrors to flash coded messages across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain. He brought in the latest military technology, including improved rifles, better maps, and faster communications. He was determined to end the Apache Wars once and for all, to capture or kill the last of the free Apache. But Geronimo was not an easy quarry. Despite his age, he remained a master of guerrilla warfare, a man who could move his people across terrain that would defeat younger, stronger men. He knew every waterhole, every hidden canyon, every secret trail in the vast wilderness of the Southwest. He could survive on foods that would poison a white man, travel for days without rest, and disappear into the landscape like smoke in the wind. The pursuit of Geronimo became a deadly game of cat and mouse that stretched across 2 countries and involved thousands of soldiers. Miles's forces would track the Apache band for weeks, following a trail of broken twigs and disturbed stones across hundreds of miles of desert, only to find that their quarry had vanished once again. Geronimo seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade capture, leading his pursuers on a merry chase through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The psychological pressure on Geronimo and his followers was enormous. They were constantly on the move, never able to rest, never able to feel safe. They were hunted by both American and Mexican forces, with no sanctuary on either side of the border. Their children were growing up without ever knowing a permanent home, their women were exhausted from the constant flight, and their warriors were wearing down under the relentless pressure. But it was not just the military pressure that was wearing down Geronimo's resolve. It was also the knowledge that he was fighting a losing battle, that the world he had known and loved was disappearing forever. The buffalo were gone, the other Apache bands had been defeated or forced onto reservations, and the white man's civilization was spreading across the land like a flood. Geronimo was not just fighting for his own freedom, he was fighting for the survival of an entire way of life. The beginning of the end came in the spring of 1886, when Geronimo's band was tracked down by a combined force of American and Mexican troops in the Sierra Madre Mountains. The Apache were caught in a canyon with no way out, surrounded by enemies who outnumbered them by more than 100 to 1. It seemed like the end had finally come for the last of the free Apache. But Geronimo was not ready to surrender. In a desperate gambit, he and his warriors launched a surprise attack on their pursuers, fighting with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The battle was brief but savage, with the Apache using every trick they had learned in a lifetime of warfare. When the smoke cleared, Geronimo and his people had once again escaped, leaving behind a trail of dead soldiers and the legend of their own invincibility. The escape from the Sierra Madre was Geronimo's last great victory, but it was also the beginning of his final defeat. The constant pressure was taking its toll on his band, and several of his followers began to talk of surrender. They were tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of living like hunted animals. They wanted to see their families again, to live in peace, even if it meant life on a reservation. Geronimo himself was beginning to waver. He had received word that his family members who had remained on the reservation were being treated well, that they were not being punished for his actions. He had also learned that the government was offering terms for his surrender that, while not generous, were at least survivable. He would not be executed, he was told, but would be sent to a reservation in the east where he could live out his days in peace. The final negotiations began in August 1886, when General Miles sent word to Geronimo that he was willing to meet and discuss terms for surrender. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries, including Apache scouts who had served with the Army and who were trusted by both sides. The location chosen was Skeleton Canyon, a remote spot in the Pelanchillo Mountains near the Arizona-New Mexico border. The meeting at Skeleton Canyon was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the American West. On one side was Geronimo, the last of the great Apache war chiefs, a man who had become a legend in his own lifetime. On the other was General Miles, representing the full power and authority of the United States government. Between them lay the fate of the Apache people and the end of an era. The negotiations were tense and difficult. Geronimo was suspicious of American promises, having been betrayed too many times in the past. He demanded guarantees for the safety of his people, assurances that they would be treated with dignity and respect. Miles, operating under strict orders from Washington, was limited in what he could promise, but he was determined to end the Apache Wars once and for all. The talks stretched on for days, with both sides probing for advantage, testing each other's resolve. Geronimo spoke of his love for his homeland, his desire to live and die in the land of his ancestors. Miles spoke of the futility of continued resistance, the impossibility of victory against the overwhelming power of the United States. It was a clash not just between two men, but between two worlds, two ways of life that could no longer coexist. In the end, it was not military defeat that brought Geronimo to surrender, but the weight of responsibility for his people. He realized that continued resistance would only bring more suffering to his followers, that the children and women who depended on him deserved a chance at life, even if it was not the life they would have chosen. On September 4, 1886, Geronimo formally surrendered to General Miles, ending the longest war in American history. The surrender ceremony was brief and somber. Geronimo, dressed in his traditional Apache clothing, approached General Miles and laid down his rifle. It was a symbolic gesture, the end of an era, the final defeat of the Apache people. The last of the free Apache had surrendered, and with them died a way of life that had existed for centuries. But the surrender was also a betrayal. Despite Miles's promises that Geronimo and his followers would be sent to a reservation in the southwest where they could be near their families, they were instead loaded onto a train and shipped to Florida, a land of swamps and humidity that was as foreign to them as the moon. They were treated not as prisoners of war, but as criminals, confined in military prisons and denied the basic rights that had been promised to them. The betrayal extended beyond Geronimo and his immediate followers. The Apache scouts who had served the U.S. Army faithfully, who had risked their lives to track down their own people, were also shipped to Florida as prisoners. Their loyalty to the United States meant nothing. They were Apache, and that was enough to condemn them. It was a final, bitter irony in a war that had been marked by betrayal and broken promises from the beginning. Geronimo spent the last 23 years of his life as a prisoner of war, first in Florida, then in Alabama, and finally at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. He became a celebrity, a living relic of the Old West, displayed at fairs and exhibitions for the entertainment of the American public. He was photographed countless times, interviewed by reporters, and turned into a symbol of the vanishing Indian that Americans could admire from a safe distance. But Geronimo never stopped being an Apache. He never stopped longing for his homeland, never stopped dreaming of the mountains and deserts of the Southwest. He learned to speak English, converted to Christianity, and even rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, but his heart remained in Apachería. He died in 1909, still a prisoner, still dreaming of home. The surrender of Geronimo marked the end of the Apache Wars, but it was not the end of the Apache people. They survived the reservations, the boarding schools, the attempts to destroy their culture and their identity. They adapted to the modern world while preserving their traditions, their language, and their connection to the land. They proved that a people's spirit cannot be broken, that culture can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The story of Geronimo's surrender is more than just the end of a war. It is the story of the collision between two worlds, two ways of life that could not coexist. It is the story of a people's struggle to maintain their identity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. It is the story of courage and betrayal, of honor and dishonor, of the price that is paid when one people conquers another. The Apache Wars were over, but their legacy lives on. They remind us of the cost of expansion, the price of progress, the human toll of manifest destiny. They tell us that history is written by the victors, but that the voices of the defeated can still be heard if we listen carefully. They show us that the conquest of the American West was not just a story of triumph, but also a story of tragedy, a story of what was lost as well as what was gained. Geronimo's surrender at Skeleton Canyon was the end of an era, the final chapter in the long and bloody history of the Apache Wars. But it was also the beginning of a new chapter, the story of how a people survived conquest and preserved their identity in a world that had changed beyond recognition. It is a story that continues to this day, a story of resilience and survival, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest adversity. Chapter 17. The Legacy of Blood and Fire. The surrender of Geronimo in September 1886 marked the official end of the Apache Wars, but the consequences of this 37-year conflict would reverberate through American history for generations to come. The longest war in American history had finally ended, but at a cost that was almost impossible to calculate. Thousands had died, entire ways of life had been destroyed, and the American West had been forever changed by the blood and fire of this epic struggle. The immediate aftermath of the Apache Wars was a period of profound transformation for both the victors and the vanquished. For the United States, the end of Apache resistance meant that the last major obstacle to the complete conquest of the American West had been removed. The Transcontinental Railroad could now operate without fear of attack. Mining operations could expand into previously dangerous territories, and settlers could move into lands that had been off-limits for decades. The dream of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to stretch from sea to shining sea, had finally been realized. But the victory had come at an enormous cost. The U.S. government had spent millions of dollars on the Apache Wars, money that could have been used for schools, roads, and other infrastructure projects. Thousands of American soldiers had died in the conflict, their lives sacrificed on the altar of expansion. The moral cost was even higher, as the nation had been forced to confront the dark side of its expansion, the brutal reality of what it meant to conquer a continent. For the Apache people, the end of the wars marked the beginning of a new and even more difficult struggle, the fight for survival in a world that no longer had a place for them. The survivors of the conflict were scattered across reservations throughout the Southwest, their traditional way of life destroyed, their culture under constant attack from government officials who were determined to civilize them. The reservation system that was imposed on the Apache was designed to be a form of cultural genocide, a systematic attempt to destroy Apache identity and replace it with white American values. Apache children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language, practice their traditional religion, or maintain any connection to their cultural heritage. They were given English names, forced to wear white clothing, and taught to be ashamed of their Apache identity. The adults fared little better. Apache men, who had once been proud warriors and hunters, were forced to become farmers on land that was often unsuitable for agriculture. They were expected to abandon their traditional roles and adopt the lifestyle of white American farmers, a transformation that many found impossible to make. Apache women, who had once held positions of respect and influence in their communities, were expected to become submissive housewives, their traditional knowledge and skills dismissed as primitive and worthless. The psychological impact of this forced transformation was devastating. Many Apache struggled with depression, alcoholism, and other forms of mental illness as they tried to cope with the destruction of their world. Suicide rates soared, families were torn apart, and the social fabric of Apache society began to unravel. The proud people who had once ruled the Southwest were reduced to dependence of the federal government, their every move monitored and controlled by Indian agents who had little understanding of or respect for Apache culture. But the Apache people proved to be remarkably resilient. Despite the best efforts of the government to destroy their culture, they found ways to preserve their traditions and pass them on to future generations. They developed a kind of cultural underground, maintaining their language, their ceremonies, and their stories in secret. They adapted to the new world that had been forced upon them while never forgetting who they were and where they came from. The legacy of the Apache Wars extended far beyond the reservations of the Southwest. The conflict had a profound impact on American military doctrine, leading to the development of new tactics and strategies that would be used in future conflicts around the world. The use of Apache scouts against other Apache became a model for the employment of indigenous forces in colonial wars, a tactic that would be used by European powers in Africa and Asia, and by the United States in its later interventions in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The Apache Wars also had a significant impact on American popular culture. The conflict captured the imagination of the American public, inspiring countless books, movies, and television shows that romanticized the struggle between the cavalry and the Apache. These popular depictions, while often inaccurate and stereotypical, helped to create a mythology around the Apache Wars that persists to this day. Geronimo, in particular, became a figure of legend, his name synonymous with fierce resistance and indomitable courage. He was transformed from a flesh-and-blood human being into a symbol, a representation of the noble savage who fought bravely against impossible odds. This romanticization of Geronimo and the Apache Wars served a psychological function for Americans, allowing them to admire the courage of their former enemies while avoiding uncomfortable questions about the morality of their conquest. The environmental impact of the Apache Wars was also significant. The conflict led to the destruction of vast areas of the Southwest as military campaigns and civilian settlements disrupted traditional ecological patterns. The buffalo herds that had once roamed the region were slaughtered, not just for their hides, but also as a deliberate strategy to deprive the Apache of a crucial food source. The delicate balance between human communities and the natural environment that the Apache had maintained for centuries was shattered, leading to erosion, desertification, and the loss of biodiversity. The Apache Wars also had important implications for the development of the American military-industrial complex. The conflict required the production of vast quantities of weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies, leading to the growth of defense contractors and the development of new technologies. The experience of fighting the Apache taught the U.S. military valuable lessons about logistics, communications, and the challenges of fighting in difficult terrain, lessons that would prove useful in future conflicts. The legal legacy of the Apache Wars was equally significant. The conflict raised important questions about the rights of indigenous peoples, the nature of sovereignty, and the limits of federal power. The treaties that were signed and broken during the course of the wars established precedents that would influence federal Indian policy for decades to come. The Supreme Court cases that arose from the conflict helped to define the legal status of Native American tribes and their relationship to the federal government. The Apache Wars also had a profound impact on the development of the American West. The end of Apache resistance opened up vast areas of the Southwest to mining, ranching, and agriculture. Towns and cities that had been under constant threat of attack could now grow and prosper. The railroad could extend its reach into previously dangerous territories, connecting remote areas to national markets and accelerating the economic development of the region. But this development came at a cost. The lands that were opened up by the defeat of the Apache were often the most sacred and culturally significant sites of the Apache people. Mountains that had been the homes of spirits, springs that had been sources of life for countless generations, and valleys that had been the scenes of important ceremonies were now claimed by white settlers and developers. The spiritual landscape of the Apache was as thoroughly conquered as their physical territory. The international implications of the Apache Wars were also significant. The conflict strained relations between the United States and Mexico, as Apache raids and military pursuits frequently crossed the border between the two countries. The wars demonstrated the challenges of fighting an enemy that did not recognize international boundaries and highlighted the need for cooperation between nations in dealing with transnational security threats. The Apache Wars also served as a testing ground for American military leaders who would go on to play important roles in later conflicts. Officers like George Crook, Nelson Miles, and John J. Pershing cut their teeth fighting the Apache, learning lessons about leadership, tactics, and the challenges of irregular warfare that would serve them well in the Spanish-American War, World War I, and other conflicts. The medical legacy of the Apache Wars was equally important. The conflict led to advances in military medicine, as Army doctors learned to treat wounds and diseases that were common in the harsh environment of the Southwest. The experience of caring for soldiers in remote and difficult conditions led to improvements in field medicine, evacuation procedures, and the treatment of tropical diseases. The Apache Wars also had a significant impact on the development of American anthropology and ethnography. The conflict brought white Americans into close contact with Apache culture for the first time, leading to the collection of vast amounts of information about Apache language, customs, and beliefs. While much of this information was collected for military purposes, it also contributed to the development of scientific understanding of Native American cultures. The psychological legacy of the Apache Wars was perhaps the most enduring of all. The conflict left deep scars on both sides, traumas that were passed down from generation to generation. For the Apache, the wars represented the destruction of their world, the end of their freedom, and the beginning of a long struggle for survival and cultural preservation. For white Americans, the wars represented both a triumph of civilization over savagery and a source of guilt and shame about the methods used to achieve that triumph. The Apache Wars also contributed to the development of American national identity. The conflict helped to define what it meant to be American, reinforcing beliefs about the superiority of American civilization and the inevitability of American expansion. At the same time, the wars raised uncomfortable questions about American values and the price of progress, questions that continue to resonate today. The economic legacy of the Apache Wars was enormous. The conflict cost the federal government millions of dollars, money that was spent on soldiers, supplies, and military infrastructure. But the wars also opened up vast areas of the Southwest to economic development, leading to the discovery of mineral wealth, the development of agriculture, and the growth of cities and towns. The economic benefits of the conquest of Apachería far outweighed the costs of the wars, at least from the perspective of white Americans. The technological legacy of the Apache Wars was equally significant. The conflict spurred the development of new weapons, communication systems, and transportation methods. The use of the telegraph to coordinate military operations, the development of improved rifles and ammunition, and the construction of roads and railroads to support military campaigns all contributed to the technological advancement of the United States. The Apache Wars also had important implications for the development of American democracy. The conflict raised questions about the rights of minorities, the limits of majority rule, and the responsibilities of government to protect all of its citizens. The treatment of the Apache during and after the wars became a test of American values and a source of ongoing debate about the nature of justice and equality. Today, more than a century after the end of the Apache Wars, the legacy of the conflict continues to shape American society. The descendants of the Apache warriors who fought so bravely for their freedom continue to struggle for recognition, respect, and the preservation of their cultural heritage. They have survived the reservations, the boarding schools, and the countless attempts to destroy their identity, proving that the human spirit cannot be conquered, even by the most determined efforts. The Apache Wars remind us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a human story of courage and cowardice, of triumph and tragedy, of the complex and often contradictory nature of human behavior. They show us that the conquest of the American West was not just a story of progress and civilization, but also a story of loss and destruction, of the price that was paid for the creation of the modern United States. The legacy of the Apache Wars is a complex and contradictory one, a mixture of pride and shame, of triumph and tragedy. It is a legacy that continues to influence American society today, reminding us of both the best and the worst aspects of our national character. It is a legacy that demands our attention, our understanding, and our commitment to learning from the mistakes of the past so that we can build a better future for all Americans, regardless of their race, culture, or heritage. The Apache Wars were more than just a military conflict. They were a defining moment in American history, a time when the nation was forced to confront the contradictions between its ideals and its actions. The legacy of that confrontation continues to shape American society today, reminding us that the price of progress is often higher than we are willing to admit, and that the true measure of a nation is not just its victories, but how it treats those it has defeated. Conclusion: the echoes of Apachería. As the sun sets over the mountains and deserts of the American Southwest, casting long shadows across the land that was once the heart of Apachería, we are left to contemplate the full scope of what transpired during those 37 years of conflict. The Apache Wars were more than just a series of battles and skirmishes. They were the death throes of an entire way of life, the final chapter in a story that had been unfolding for thousands of years. The numbers alone tell only part of the story. Thousands died on both sides, millions of dollars were spent, and vast territories changed hands. But behind these statistics lie human stories of incredible courage, devastating loss, and the eternal struggle between freedom and security, between tradition and progress, between the old world and the new. The Apache people who fought in these wars were not the savage enemies that they were often portrayed as in the newspapers and dime novels of the day. They were human beings fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. They were parents who wanted their children to grow up free, elders who wanted to preserve the wisdom of their ancestors, and warriors who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The American soldiers who fought against them were not the heroes or villains that popular culture has often made them out to be. They were men doing their duty as they understood it, following orders in a conflict that few of them fully comprehended. Some fought with honor and treated their enemies with respect. Others committed acts of brutality that stained the honor of their uniforms. Most were simply trying to survive in a war that seemed to have no end and no clear purpose beyond the expansion of American power. The Apache Wars were a product of their time, a reflection of the values and beliefs that shaped 19th century America. The doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief in the superiority of American civilization, and the conviction that progress required the displacement of primitive peoples all contributed to the inevitability of the conflict. But the wars were also shaped by individual choices, by moments of courage and cowardice, of honor and betrayal, that remind us that history is made by human beings, not by abstract forces. The legacy of the Apache Wars extends far beyond the battlefields of Arizona and New Mexico. The conflict helped to shape American military doctrine, influenced the development of the American West, and contributed to the creation of the mythology that surrounds the frontier period of American history. The wars also left deep scars on the Apache people, wounds that have never fully healed and that continue to influence their communities today. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Apache Wars is the reminder they provide of the resilience of the human spirit. The Apache people survived the wars, the reservations, the boarding schools, and the countless attempts to destroy their culture and their identity. They adapted to the modern world while preserving their traditions, their language, and their connection to the land. They proved that a people's spirit cannot be broken, that culture can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Today, the descendants of the great Apache warriors continue to live in the Southwest on reservations that bear little resemblance to the vast territories their ancestors once roamed. They face new challenges: poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, and the ongoing struggle to preserve their cultural heritage in a rapidly changing world. But they also carry within them the strength and courage of their ancestors, the same spirit that enabled Cochise, Geronimo, and Victorio to fight against impossible odds. The Apache Wars remind us that the conquest of the American West was not a simple story of good versus evil, of civilization versus savagery. It was a complex and often tragic collision between two very different ways of life, two different concepts of what it meant to be human, two different visions of how people should live on the earth. Neither side was entirely right or entirely wrong. Both were products of their time and their circumstances. The wars also remind us of the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives. For too long, the story of the Apache Wars was told only from the American point of view, with the Apache portrayed as obstacles to progress rather than as human beings fighting for their survival. Only in recent decades have historians begun to tell the full story, to give voice to the Apache perspective, and to acknowledge the complexity and tragedy of the conflict. As we look back on the Apache Wars from the perspective of the 21st century, we can see them as both a triumph and a tragedy. They were a triumph for the United States, which succeeded in its goal of conquering the continent and establishing its dominance over the American West. But they were also a tragedy for the Apache people, who lost their homeland, their freedom, and much of their traditional way of life. The Apache Wars were also a tragedy for America itself, a reminder of the price that was paid for the creation of the modern United States. The conflict forced the nation to confront the contradictions between its ideals of freedom and equality and its actions toward indigenous peoples. It revealed the dark side of manifest destiny, the brutal reality of what it meant to conquer a continent. But the Apache Wars were also a story of hope, a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure even the most terrible circumstances. The Apache people survived, and their culture survives with them. Their languages are still spoken, their ceremonies are still performed, and their stories are still told. They have found ways to honor their ancestors while adapting to the modern world, to preserve their traditions while embracing change. The mountains and deserts of the Southwest still echo with the memory of the Apache Wars. In the wind that blows through the canyons, in the shadows that dance across the mesas, in the silence of the vast spaces where the battles were fought, the spirits of the warriors still ride. They remind us of the price of freedom, the cost of conquest, and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to survive, and to remember. The Apache Wars were the longest war in American history, but they were also much more than that. They were a defining moment in the creation of the modern United States, a test of the nation's character, and a reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of American history. They were a story of courage and cowardice, of honor and betrayal, of triumph and tragedy. As we remember the Apache Wars, we honor not just the memory of those who fought and died, but also the lessons they teach us about the nature of conflict, the price of progress, and the importance of understanding and respecting those who are different from ourselves. We remember that history is not just about the past, but about the present and the future, about the choices we make and the legacy we leave for those who come after us. The Apache Wars are over, but their echoes continue to reverberate through American society. They remind us that the conquest of the American West was not just a story of triumph, but also a story of loss, not just a story of progress, but also a story of destruction. They challenge us to confront the difficult truths about our past and to learn from them as we work to build a better future. In the end, the Apache Wars were a human story, a story of people trying to survive in a world that was changing beyond recognition. It was a story of love and hate, of hope and despair, of the eternal struggle between the forces of change and the desire to preserve what is precious and sacred. It was a story that belongs not just to the Apache people or to the American people, but to all of humanity, a reminder of both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for greatness. The sun has set on the Apache Wars, but the memory of those who fought and died in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest will never fade. They live on in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, and the choices we make. They remind us that freedom is never free, that progress always comes at a cost, and that the true measure of a people is not just their victories, but how they treat those they have defeated. This is the story of the Apache Wars, the longest war in American history, a conflict that shaped a nation and defined an era. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, understood, and honored, not just for what it tells us about the past, but for what it teaches us about ourselves and our responsibilities to future generations. The echoes of Apachería will continue to resound through the canyons of time, reminding us of the price of conquest and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to survive, and to remember. Epilogue: The Survivors. In the years that followed the end of the Apache Wars, the survivors of that great conflict found themselves scattered across a continent that had been forever changed by their struggle. The Apache people, once the masters of a vast domain that stretched from Texas to Arizona, from New Mexico deep into Mexico, were now confined to small reservations, their movements monitored, their traditions suppressed, their children taken away to be civilized in distant boarding schools. But survival for the Apache had always been about more than just staying alive. It was about preserving the essence of what it meant to be Apache, about maintaining the connections to the land, to the ancestors, and to each other that had sustained them through centuries of hardship and conflict. In the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, they found ways to endure, to adapt, and to keep alive the flame of their culture. The reservation at San Carlos, that Hell's 40 acres where so many Apache had been forced to live, became a crucible of survival and resistance. despite the harsh conditions, the inadequate rations, and the constant surveillance by government agents, the Apache found ways to maintain their identity. They told their stories in whispers, performed their ceremonies in secret, and passed down their knowledge to their children in ways that the authorities could not detect or prevent. The children who were taken to boarding schools like the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Torn from their families at young ages, forbidden to speak their native languages, forced to abandon their traditional clothing and customs, they were subjected to a systematic attempt to erase their Apache identity. The motto of these schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man," and they pursued this goal with ruthless efficiency. Yet even in these institutions of cultural destruction, the Apache spirit proved impossible to extinguish. Students found ways to communicate in their native languages, to share stories and songs, from home to maintain connections to their heritage despite the best efforts of their teachers and administrators. Some, like the famous athlete Jim Thorpe, used their experiences at these schools to achieve success in the white world while never forgetting their roots. The Apache, who had served as scouts for the U.S. Army, faced their own unique challenges. Men like Mickey Free, who had been the kidnapped boy whose capture had sparked the Bascom affair, found themselves caught between two worlds. They had served the American military faithfully, using their skills and knowledge to track down their own people, yet they were still viewed with suspicion and distrust by many white Americans. Their loyalty to the United States had not protected them from the same fate as their more hostile relatives. Many were also sent to Florida as prisoners of war. The women who had fought alongside their men in the Apache Wars faced particular hardships in the post-war period. Women like Lozin, who had been respected warriors and leaders, found their roles drastically diminished in the confined world of the reservation. The traditional Apache respect for women's wisdom and authority was undermined by government policies that imposed white American gender roles on Apache society. Yet these women found ways to maintain their influence, often working behind the scenes to preserve Apache traditions and to protect their families from the worst excesses of government policy. The spiritual leaders of the Apache people, the medicine men and women who had guided their people through the darkest days of the wars, faced perhaps the greatest persecution of all. Their ceremonies were banned, their sacred objects confiscated, and their very existence was seen as a threat to the government's assimilation policies. Yet they too found ways to survive, practicing their healing arts in secret, maintaining the sacred knowledge that connected the Apache people to their ancestors and to the land. The land itself bore the scars of the Apache Wars. The sacred sites where the Apache had conducted their ceremonies for generations were now off limits, claimed by white settlers or designated as military reservations. The springs where they had gathered for countless generations were now controlled by ranchers and miners. The mountains where their ancestors were buried were now crossed by railroads and telegraph lines. The very landscape that had shaped Apache identity was being transformed by the forces of American expansion. Yet the land remembered. In the hidden canyons and remote mesas of the Southwest, the spirits of the Apache warriors were said to still ride. Travelers reported seeing ghostly figures on horseback moving silently through the desert night. Ranchers spoke of strange sounds echoing from the mountains, the war cries of long-dead warriors still defending their homeland. The land itself seemed to mourn the passing of the Apache way of life. The American soldiers who had fought in the Apache Wars also carried their own scars from the conflict. Many struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the brutal fighting and the harsh conditions of desert warfare. Some, like General George Crook, became advocates for better treatment of Native Americans, using their influence to try to ameliorate the worst aspects of government policy. Others simply tried to forget, to put the memories of the Apache Wars behind them, and move on with their lives. The officers who had led the campaigns against the Apache found their careers shaped by their experiences in the Southwest. Men like Nelson Miles and John J. Pershing used their reputations as Indian fighters to advance in the military hierarchy, eventually commanding American forces in larger conflicts like the Spanish-American War and World War I. The tactics they had learned fighting the Apache, the use of indigenous scouts, the importance of mobility and logistics in difficult terrain, the challenges of fighting an elusive enemy, would prove valuable in these later conflicts. The civilians who had lived through the Apache Wars also bore the marks of their experience. The settlers who had survived Apache raids carried physical and psychological scars that would last for the rest of their lives. The children who had grown up in constant fear of attack developed a wariness and suspicion that colored their view of the world. The communities that had been repeatedly attacked struggled to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. Yet there were also stories of reconciliation and understanding. Some white Americans who had fought against the Apache came to respect and even admire their former enemies. They recognized the courage and skill of the Apache warriors, the justice of their cause, and the tragedy of their defeat. These individuals often became advocates for better treatment of the Apache people, using their influence to try to improve conditions on the reservations. The Mexican people who lived along the border also felt the impact of the Apache Wars long after the fighting had ended. The raids and counter-raids that had characterized the conflict had devastated many communities, leaving behind a legacy of fear and mistrust. The complex relationships between Apache bands, Mexican communities, and American forces had created a web of alliances and enmities that would take generations to untangle. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, the Apache people found themselves facing new challenges and opportunities. The allotment policies of the federal government threatened to break up the reservations and scatter the Apache people even further. The discovery of mineral wealth on some reservation lands created new conflicts over resource rights. The growth of tourism in the Southwest brought visitors who were curious about Apache culture, but often had little understanding of its depth and complexity. Yet the Apache people also found new ways to assert their identity and protect their interests. They began to use the American legal system to defend their rights, filing lawsuits to protect their land and water rights. They started to organize politically, forming tribal governments that could negotiate with federal and state authorities. They began to document their own history, working with sympathetic anthropologists and historians to ensure that their version of events would be preserved for future generations. The children and grandchildren of the Apache warriors began to find their own ways to honor their heritage while succeeding in the modern world. Some became teachers, doctors, and lawyers, using their education to serve their communities. Others became artists and writers, using their talents to preserve and share Apache culture. Still others became activists and politicians, fighting for the rights of Native Americans and working to improve conditions on the reservations. The memory of the Apache Wars became a source of both pride and pain for the Apache people. They were proud of their ancestors' courage and resistance, of their refusal to surrender their freedom without a fight. But they also mourned the losses, the warriors who had died in battle, the elders who had passed away in captivity, the children who had been taken from their families and never returned. The wars had preserved Apache honor, but at a terrible cost. As the 20th century progressed, the Apache people found themselves caught up in the larger currents of American history. They served in both world wars, fighting for a country that had once been their enemy. They participated in the civil rights movement, drawing parallels between their own struggle for recognition and the fight for racial equality. They witnessed the transformation of the American West from a frontier region to a modern urbanized society. Through it all, they maintained their identity as Apache people. They preserved their languages, even as English became the dominant tongue. They continued their ceremonies, even as Christianity spread through their communities. They maintained their connection to the land, even as the modern world encroached on their traditional territories. They proved that a people's spirit cannot be broken. that culture can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Today, more than a century after the end of the Apache Wars, the descendants of those who fought in that great conflict continue to live in the Southwest. They face new challenges: poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, and the ongoing struggle to preserve their cultural heritage in a rapidly changing world. But they also have new opportunities: education, economic development, and the growing recognition of Native American rights and sovereignty. The Apache people have survived the wars, the reservations, the boarding schools, and the countless attempts to destroy their culture and their identity. They have adapted to the modern world while preserving their traditions, their language, and their connection to the land. They have proven that the human spirit cannot be conquered, that a people's identity cannot be erased, and that the bonds that connect us to our ancestors and our homeland are stronger than any force that seeks to break them. The Apache Wars are over, but the Apache people endure. They carry within them the strength and courage of their ancestors, the same spirit that enabled Cochise, Geronimo, and Victorio to fight against impossible odds. They are the living legacy of those who refuse to surrender their freedom, the proof that resistance is never futile, and that the human spirit will always find a way to survive and to thrive. In the end, the true victory of the Apache Wars belongs not to those who conquered, but to those who survived. The Apache people are still here, still proud, still Apache. They are the ultimate testament to the power of the human spirit to endure, to adapt, and to overcome. They are the living proof that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always come, and that no matter how fierce the storm, the human spirit will always find a way to weather it and emerge stronger than before. The echoes of the Apache Wars will continue to resonate through the canyons and mesas of the Southwest for generations to come. They remind us of the price of freedom, the cost of conquest, and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to survive, and to remember. They are a testament to the courage of those who fought, the wisdom of those who survived, and the hope of those who continue to carry the Apache flame into the future. Final reflections. The Unbroken Circle. As we reach the end of this long and complex story, it is important to remember that the Apache Wars were not just a historical event that happened long ago in a distant place. They were part of a larger pattern of conflict and conquest that shaped the entire North American continent, a pattern that began with the first European settlements and continued well into the 20th century. The Apache Wars were unique in their duration and intensity, but they were also representative of the broader struggle between indigenous peoples and European colonizers that defined much of American history. The story of the Apache Wars is also a reminder that history is not just about great leaders and famous battles, but about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. It is about Apache mothers trying to protect their children, about American soldiers far from home trying to do their duty, about Mexican villagers caught between two warring peoples, about traders and settlers and missionaries and government officials all trying to make sense of a world that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. The Apache Wars teach us that there are no simple answers to complex problems, no easy solutions to the conflicts that arise when different peoples with different values and different ways of life are forced to share the same space. The wars were not just about land or resources or political power, though all of these things played a role. They were about fundamental questions of identity, of belonging, of what it means to be human in a world where different groups of humans have very different ideas about how life should be lived. The Apache people who fought in these wars were not fighting just for territory or political independence, though these things were important to them. They were fighting for the right to exist as Apache people, to maintain their connection to the land that had shaped them, to preserve the traditions and values that gave their lives meaning. They were fighting for the right to be different, to live according to their own understanding of what it meant to be human. The American soldiers and settlers who opposed them were not simply greedy land grabbers or bloodthirsty killers, though some certainly were. Most were people who genuinely believed that they were bringing civilization and progress to a savage wilderness, that they were fulfilling a divine mandate to spread American values and institutions across the continent. They saw themselves as agents of progress, as pioneers of a better way of life. The tragedy of the Apache Wars was that both sides were, in their own way, right. The Apache were right to fight for their homeland, their freedom, and their way of life. The Americans were right to believe that their civilization had much to offer the world. But the tragedy was that these two rights could not coexist, that the expansion of American civilization required the destruction of Apache culture, that progress for one people meant catastrophe for another. This is the central paradox of American history. A nation founded on the principles of freedom and equality that achieved its greatness through the conquest and subjugation of other peoples. The Apache Wars were just one chapter in this larger story, but they were a particularly important chapter because they lasted so long and because they involved such a complete collision between two very different ways of understanding the world. The Apache Wars also remind us that the past is not really past, that the consequences of historical events continue to shape the present in ways that we often do not fully understand. The poverty and social problems that plague many Native American communities today are not just the result of current policies or contemporary circumstances. They are the legacy of centuries of conquest, displacement, and cultural destruction. The Apache people are still dealing with the consequences of the wars that ended more than a century ago. But the Apache Wars also teach us about the resilience of the human spirit, about the capacity of people to survive and even thrive in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Apache people did not just survive the wars and their aftermath. They found ways to preserve their culture, to maintain their identity, and to adapt to a changing world while remaining true to their essential values. They proved that conquest is not the same thing as victory, that a people's spirit cannot be broken by force alone. The story of the Apache Wars is also a story about the power of memory, about the importance of remembering and honoring the past, even when it is painful or difficult to confront. For too long, the story of these wars was told only from one perspective, with the Apache portrayed as obstacles to progress rather than as human beings fighting for their survival. Only in recent decades have historians begun to tell the full story, to give voice to the Apache perspective, and to acknowledge the complexity and tragedy of the conflict. This process of historical recovery is not just an academic exercise, it is a moral imperative. We cannot understand who we are as Americans without understanding the full story of how America was created, including the parts of that story that are uncomfortable or shameful. We cannot build a just and equitable society without acknowledging the injustices of the past and working to address their continuing consequences. The Apache Wars also teach us about the importance of cultural diversity, about the value of different ways of understanding and living in the world. The Apache people had developed over thousands of years a sophisticated understanding of how to live in harmony with the harsh environment of the Southwest. They had created a culture that valued courage, honor, and loyalty, that respected the wisdom of elders and the potential of youth, that understood the interconnectedness of all living things. When this culture was destroyed or suppressed, the world lost something valuable and irreplaceable. We lost a different way of seeing and understanding the natural world, a different approach to community and family relationships, a different understanding of what it means to be human. The homogenization of culture that accompanied American expansion was not just a loss for the Apache people, it was a loss for all of humanity. The Apache Wars remind us that progress is not always progressive, that change is not always improvement, that the victory of one way of life over another is not necessarily a victory for humanity as a whole. They challenge us to think more carefully about what we mean by progress, about what we are willing to sacrifice in the name of advancement, about what we owe to those who are different from ourselves. As we look back on the Apache Wars from the perspective of the 21st century, we can see them as both a tragedy and a lesson. They were a tragedy because they involved the destruction of a way of life that had existed for thousands of years, the death of thousands of people, and the infliction of suffering that continues to this day. But they were also a lesson about the importance of understanding and respecting cultural differences, about the need to find ways for different peoples to coexist peacefully, about the dangers of assuming that one way of life is inherently superior to another. The Apache Wars were the longest war in American history, but they were also much more than that. They were a defining moment in the creation of the modern United States, a test of the nation's character and a reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of American history. They were a story of courage and cowardice, of honor and betrayal, of triumph and tragedy. The warriors who fought in these wars, both Apache and American, deserve to be remembered not just as historical figures, but as human beings who faced impossible choices and did their best to act with honor and dignity in circumstances that often made honor and dignity impossible. They were products of their time and their culture, shaped by forces beyond their control, yet they still had to make choices about how to live and how to die. The Apache Wars ended more than a century ago, but their echoes continue to reverberate through American society. They remind us that the conquest of the American West was not just a story of triumph, but also a story of loss, not just a story of progress, but also a story of destruction. They challenge us to confront the difficult truths about our past and to learn from them as we work to build a better future. In the end, the Apache Wars were a human story, a story of people trying to survive and to preserve what they held most dear in a world that was changing beyond recognition. It was a story of love and hate, of hope and despair, of the eternal struggle between the forces of change and the desire to preserve what is precious and sacred. It was a story that belongs not just to the Apache people or to the American people, but to all of humanity. A reminder of both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for greatness. The sun has set on the Apache Wars, but the memory of those who fought and died in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest will never fade. They live on in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, and the choices we make. They remind us that freedom is never free, that progress always comes at a cost, and that the true measure of a people is not just their victories, but how they treat those they have defeated. This is the complete story of the Apache Wars, the longest war in American history, a conflict that shaped a nation and defined an era. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, understood, and honored, not just for what it tells us about the past, but for what it teaches us about ourselves and our responsibilities to future generations. The echoes of Apachería will continue to resound through the canyons of time, reminding us of the price of conquest and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to survive, and to remember. The circle is unbroken. The story continues. The Apache people endure.